Hey guys, welcome to a whole brand new series. I know it's been a while since I did a long format introduction, but I wanted to take a second to introduce this series. This is something I worked on for a while and was a little difficult to create because I know the South pretty good, so that was easy to create. And the Midwest is basically just the South with snow, so that one was also easy to create. But out west, I just know nothing about. And the way I divided it up spreads out over many different states and various cultures. And I guess with that, I should name the states we are covering. Starting with Alaska, Arizona, California, which coincidentally is one of my favorite Lana songs, Colorado, Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. And we won't be covering all these in part 1, but over the series, we will visit them multiple times. With that being said, grab your Tim's Cascade snacks and your Zia root beer. We are taking a mysterious trip out west. October 19th, 1985, Anchorage, Alaska. Just after midnight, 25-year-old Douglas Cleaves was sitting with his sister Susan, who had came to visit, along with his girlfriend and another lady, his neighbor, who sometimes helped babysit his son. Earlier that night, the four had sat down to a nice dinner and began watching a movie, but it was now in the early morning hours something odd and frightening would occur. They would hear 2 knocks at the door, and loud ones at that. Now I'm unsure if this is something that happened commonly, or maybe they were expecting company, but they did not seem alarmed. Instead, Doug's sister would get up to open the door. When she cracked it open to look, she seen a masked individual standing outside wearing a balaclava, gloves, and a trench coat, and holding a bolt-action hunting rifle. She immediately attempted to shut the door, but the man maneuvered the barrel of the gun between the door and the frame, preventing it from shutting. The gunman then quickly made his way into the home, shoving Susan out of the way, before heading straight towards Doug, who was laying on a pillow on the ground. And I should probably point out here, just a few months prior to this, Doug had suffered an accident at work that left him disabled, as his legs had to be amputated after an incident involving an electrical shock. So Doug now lay defenseless on a pillow on the ground without his prosthetics and was essentially at the whims of this crazy individual. Meanwhile, Doug's girlfriend and neighbor, who had been on the floor near him, rolled out of his way, screaming in the process, and then fleeing to a back room. It is at this time that Doug would state, "Hey, don't shoot. I understand what's going on. Don't shoot. We can work this out." Unfortunately, the killer would ignore the plea and shoot Doug 3 times in the head and twice in the chest, before turning around and immediately running back out the door and disappearing. And obviously, the authorities were called immediately, and they actually made it there quite quick, reaching the home at 12:22 a.m., but they had just missed the killer. They soon taped the scene off and began interviews with his sister, girlfriend, and neighbor, as well as other people in the neighborhood. They soon found out that this masked person had actually went up to the home wearing the mask, never giving anyone a chance to identify them. They also identified the rifle, but never publicly released that info, instead just verifying that it was indeed a high-powered hunting rifle. The suspect was described as being thin and around 5'7", which actually kinda adds a bit of intrigue to this case, because many people think this anonymous killer was a woman. In fact, police would never come out and clarify either way if their suspect was a man or woman, which I guess means that all the other witnesses were not for sure either. Crazily enough, neighbors who had heard the gunshots got a pretty good description of the vehicle and, even more importantly, got the license plate number. Unfortunately, this vehicle did not belong to the shooter, nor was it connected, and what seemed like a good break early on led to disappointment, because everyone was so focused on this car that was just randomly driving through the area that they completely missed where the killer really fled to. And this proved to be a bad sign for the investigation to come, because the police had nothing and it went cold within just a few weeks. And a reward of $10,000 would be posted for any tips that could lead to an answer. and that was up to $25,000 not long after, and again, nothing. And because Anchorage itself experienced an uptick in gun-related crimes, Doug's case kinda just got lost in the shuffle, and it was never solved, making it a cold case for nearly 4 decades. And there's been very little movement on it since, and it's rarely discussed online. But there are a few theories that circulate around it, like one of the early ones that seems to pop up in all kinds of unsolved cases. Was it drug-related? The drug theory in this one comes down to one accusation leveled against Doug. See, him and his ex-wife had went through a bitter divorce, which seen Doug actually win the custody of their child, something that doesn't happen often. This, of course, left Doug's ex-wife and mother of their child, Charlotte, pretty upset. And at the hearing to determine parental custody, she claimed that Doug not only smoked pot, but he also used other drugs and was a drug dealer. Doug, to his credit, admitted he did smoke pot, but never around their child, but he was adamant that he did not deal in or touch any other drugs, and the judge must have gotten some information that Doug was telling the truth, because he did rule in favor of him getting custody, while Charlotte only got visitation time, although the judge did make both of them take parental classes. Regardless, there's never been a shred of evidence pop up to indicate Doug was involved in the drug trade at all. Even in the past 4 decades, nothing has been uncovered that would hint at that, or at the thought that he may have been on harder drugs. It's also worth pointing out that Charlotte really had nothing to lose by lying about the drug issues, as she was trying to win full custody, which has certainly muddied the investigation and, by extension, Doug's name. But there are other theories, such as money. Doug, as mentioned, had just went through a horrible work accident resulting in the loss of his legs while also getting his fingers badly damaged, and since it did happen at a work site, he was going to get a hefty payout. And Doug had plans for this money. He wanted to start an air taxi company that he could still operate even with his disability, and he hoped he could hand the company and money over to his son one day. In fact, this huge settlement that Doug was getting would go directly to Robert upon Doug's death. And if Doug was to die before Robert grew to be of legal age, then obviously Charlotte would get full custody of Robert. So you can kind of see where this is going. In fact, Doug had reportedly tried to get a restraining order against his ex-wife before he was murdered. And of course, after Doug's death, Charlotte would get full custody, and by extension, control of Robert's money. She then soon married her boyfriend and moved away and had more children. She would then change Robert's last name to the new husband's last name and kinda erase Doug and that part of her child's life. But if detectives were working under the thought that Charlotte was responsible, nothing ever came from it. However, in June 1989, the lead investigator, A. Joe Austin, in an interview with reporters, would state that law enforcement had a good idea about who did kill Doug, but they could not come up with the proof needed to actually press charges, and they were still looking for that key piece of evidence, which I assume never came to fruition. Other than that, the only other person of interest that is known publicly about, at least, was a man named Michael Hagwood. Precious little was known about him, and what we do know comes from Doug's sister, Susan, who stated in an interview that police would only tell her that Hagwood was a person of interest and never explained why or even hinted at how he could have knew Doug. But he did live in the small town Hashugiak, about 20 miles north of Anchorage. Unfortunately, in 2013, 49-year-old Michael Hagwood would kill his 40-year-old girlfriend, Nita Kilipsik, and then shot himself. And even in that tragedy, police have been very tight-lipped about the details, even keeping the make of the gun a secret, which of course have led to many wondering if it could have been the same weapon used to kill Doug. October 18th, 1984, near the Grand Coulee Dam in eastern Washington, brothers Rick and Pete Tim would come across something truly bizarre while rounding up cattle at their father's farm. Somehow, a chunk of earth weighing about 3 tons was lifted up and moved 73 feet away and then set back down. What made it particularly interesting was it had not been done with any dirt moving equipment. No shovels, no bulldozers. There was no signs left from any excavation equipment, nor was there any dirt left at the scene. It actually looked like someone had set a giant cookie cutter down into the earth, extracted the dirt, and then moved it, for some reason. And geologists were able to determine for sure that it was not moved by human beings. The slab was mostly made of soil held together by roots, and it was about 10 feet long and 7 feet wide, with a thickness of about 1.5 feet to 2 feet. It also perfectly matched the hole left in the ground 70 feet away, although it had been rotated 20 degrees. There were dribblings of dirt, about the size of a fingernail, that showed the line the chunk traveled to its resting place. Now the team speculated whatever had happened must have occurred after mid-September, because they had harvested wheat in that field around that time, and the earth had not been displaced then. But as to what had happened, they had no idea, which is why geologists were brought in to look, but they too were stumped. They first contended that it may have been caused by an earthquake, and strangely enough, earthquakes had been known to cause this phenomena before, and this area had suffered a 3.0 earthquake just a week prior to the brothers making the discovery. So the initial theory was that the bedrock may have been able to focus the energy from the seismic waves which caused the earth to eject this slab some 70 feet away. However, University of Washington scientists were soon able to dismiss that claim, as the earthquake was not strong enough to do this, and not to mention, the epicenter was 20 miles away, canceling out the earthquake theory. They also looked into the thought that it was caused by a meteorite, but there was not one sign of impact. It also didn't match the fact that the crater had vertical walls and an almost perfectly flat bottom. They also noted how roots from plants dangled from the walls of the hole, indicating that the dirt had been torn out and not cut out. Scientists then began to look at other possibilities. Was it conceivable a tornado hit? Although tornadoes don't hit often west of the Rockies, it does happen. But considering there were no signs of swirling in the vegetation, a tornado was also ruled out. A gas explosion was then looked at next, but there was no methane in the area. They even looked at the possibility that someone froze the ground somehow and excavated it out, perhaps using a helicopter to move it, in the hopes of turning the area into a tourist spot. But this area was just too remote for that. Not to mention, excavation like that would be way too expensive. So that leaves, of course, the one theory that I know you were waiting for. A UFO did it. Strangely enough, there were actually several UFO sightings given from local residents around this time. One person in particular talked to a farmer who found a circular burned area about 30 feet in diameter that appeared as if someone had set something down and scorched the ground. And just 6 days before discovering the hole, a report had been made of a quote-unquote meteor sighting in the area. Even stranger, during the so-called earthquake, residents reported feeling what they described as a sonic blast that accompanied it, like an air blast, while a roar described as an approaching freight train preceded the blast. Curiously, going back to the earthquake theory, about 5 years prior, in 1979, a 3.5 earthquake hit near the Utah-Idaho border and led to farmers finding a mysterious hole outside Portage, Idaho. This time, it was shaped like a cross and about 14 feet in diameter, and it too was undisturbed. However, there was one key difference. The Idaho slab of dirt had been broken into pieces, leaving the mystery of the cookie cutter slab of dirt found in Washington, which is still a mystery to this day. September 9th, 2004. Flat Tops White River National Forest, Colorado. 2 elk bow hunters were crawling through the forest in a very remote area when they came across a tent and campsite. It was up around 10,000 feet and 12 miles from the trail out of town. They thought it odd to find this abandoned camp way up here, so they searched it. That's when they would be shocked to find remains inside the tent, and not fresh ones. It was a skeleton by this point. The sheriff's department was called, and they came out to take a look at the scene. And they were really surprised and called it a 1 in a million find, because the location of this camp You almost had to walk up on top of it to see it. They believe he had died some 1 to 5 years earlier between 1999 and 2003 and was anywhere between 27 to 65 years old. Inside the tent, they found a notebook which the person did not leave a name on, which was frustrating because he did not carry ID, but he did leave a note. On the first page, it read, "Lib, I should write in case my situation here doesn't improve. This may be the end of my journey. Would like you to claim the body, services, or memorial, cremation." Who this Lib is has never been discerned, and neither would the rest of the letter, because it was illegible except for a few words, such as I, and though, and favor, or flavor. The back page of the note was a little bit more readable, but it didn't make much sense, like one sentence that read, "Third choice, take them up in a glider. I promise not to get sick on you." Then it gets illegible again, but other words are identified, like this, you, and not. Another page reads, AR, and would you call her, while each page at the bottom has the words capital ANY 25,000, which suggest a will with his initials, which obviously is not very much to go on, and seems to leave more questions than answers. It's believed his death was natural or due to exposure of the elements, but that could never be confirmed. It's also thought he was possibly from Australia, which they came to the conclusion because of the sleeping bag they had found, which was a brand made only in Australia. The main clue in finding out this man's identity is Lib. Just who is she? She seems very important to the person who wrote this, yet she apparently has not realized he is missing, or maybe she has reported him and it's just not been connected yet. But there were other items of interest that stuck out to detectives. One was the high-quality dental work that the man had done in the past. It seemed to indicate that he most likely was not homeless, and instead came from a middle to high middle-class home, which makes it stranger that no one noted his disappearance. Although it is possible he just had a few close connections, which explains why he wasn't reported missing. He also most likely had a back injury leading to spinal problems, and he was also a smoker. He was also carrying over $600 worth of bills that were all less than 5 years old. His camping equipment included a butane stove with 2 fuel cans, tent repair kit, a canteen, compass, cooking pot, and drinking cups. He also had 2 moisture-proof trail maps with a route drawn across an area where the remains were discovered. He also carried a Radio Shack 4-in-1 game along with a pocket-sized battleship. A reconstruction of his face was made later on, but this also did not lead to anyone coming forward to identify him, and he has since become known as the Garfield County John Doe, or Flat Tops John Doe. Nearly 2 decades later, the man has still not been identified. Theories about how he got here and what happened are divided, but judging by the route drawn on his maps, it's likely he hiked the entire way, as there is no public transportation in the area, although it is possible that these maps had been discarded by someone else with their routes drawn in, and the man just picked them up. Others wonder if maybe this Lib person was hiking with him. The main reason for this is because he had a lot of things in pairs, like 2 canteens, 2 maps, 2 drinking cups, and games that would be for 2 players, which leads to the obvious question, why did Lib, or whoever this other person is, just abandon him here? There's also the question of his vehicle. He would have most certainly had to have gotten a ride to the trailhead, as there was no public transportation that ran there. So was his car ever found? Or was it hauled off and a connection was never made? Or did a friend drop him off? If so, why didn't this friend ever check back in? Likewise, why was he even here? Was he suffering a terminal illness and just wanted to die in the woods? Or had he suffered a life change, like job loss or relationship breakup, and was just camping to clear his head? Well, that's what authorities looked at, but they were a little confused because the tent and campsite suggested he had already stayed there through 1 winter. So he was coming up on 1 whole year of being at this location. And was he from the other side of the world in Australia? It seems likely, as he also had earplugs, which could suggest long-distance travel. And finally, the death. No one is sure what happened with it either. It's possible he just died from a heart attack, or stroke, but it's just as possible he died during a blizzard, or perhaps he overdosed on pain medication he was taking for his back. A darker theory suggests he got injured and Lib, or whoever else was accompanying him, got lost in trying to find him help and they perished alone somewhere else. March 28, 2003, Snowflake, Arizona. 66-year-old June Goodman would go over to visit her sister Pat at her home and spend the evening together, something they did frequently. The two would enjoy each other's company while talking the evening away. Much of June's conversation revolved around her upcoming retirement after spending years working for the post office. As the night wore on to around 8 p.m., June decided it was time to go home, as she had to get up early to go to work the next morning. She would leave and stop at a little convenience store to pick up some candy before getting back into her car around 8:25 p.m. and making her way home. Now, June lived alone after the passing of her husband many years prior, and although her home sat at the end of a quarter-mile dirt road, she felt completely safe, as she had lived there for years and it was a good community. And she arrived home that night, ate her chocolate candy, and then went to bed. But the next morning would take a strange turn, because at the post office, June never arrived. This was seen as extremely odd because June was known to be very reliable and usually arrived pretty early to work so she could prepare for her deliveries. Her co-workers decided to call her to see if she was okay and was still coming in, but no one answered. This heightened their concern, and one of the employees had June's sister's phone number, the same one she had spent the evening with before. They would call her and ask her if she knew why June had not came in. This, of course, alarmed her sister, who immediately got in her car and drove across town to check on her. I imagine she probably feared a medical emergency, considering her age. But her sister Pat would discover something else much more concerning. Upon arriving, she would notice immediately that the sliding glass door connecting to the backyard was halfway open, while her mail van was still parked in its normal spot. Adding to the mystery was the outside lights remained on, which Pat knew June always turned them off before going to bed. She would slowly take a step inside and seeing the television was left on, and for Pat, that was enough. She called the police, who arrived very quickly to find a puzzling scene. They had no idea where to start, as there was essentially nothing to go on. For one, nothing had been stolen, ruling out robbery. Even stranger was all of June's shoes were accounted for, meaning she had left barefoot. Likewise, her dog was left behind, which June would never abandon. Now, coincidentally, June was actually related to U.S. Representative Jeff Flake and the Arizona House Speaker. So unsurprisingly, the heat was on law enforcement to figure out what happened and figure it out quickly. And going by these two powerful connections, they soon began to wonder, could her disappearance be connected to the political world? Well, although the conspiracy sounded intriguing, it quickly led to a dead end, and the investigation had to go back to square one. They soon began to put a theory into motion though. They believed June had been sitting in her recliner watching TV, which allowed her to see directly into the long dirt driveway to her home. They thought it was possible a car pulled up, and the headlights alerted June, who then got up, opened the glass door to greet someone, and then never walked back inside the home. But there was one issue with this. There was not one footprint in the dirt directly in front of the back door, nor was there a sign of a struggle. It got even more confusing when they brought in dogs and searchers on foot, and then even a helicopter to search the surrounding area. But no scent was found by the dogs, and not one sign of her was found anywhere near the home, other than the back door had been left open. A police spokesman would even note that it appeared as if she had stepped out the back door and vanished into thin air. And while that most certainly didn't happen, they did wonder if she had stepped out to get into a vehicle willingly, either to talk to someone or to go to somewhere else, and then something happened, or maybe she left intentionally, planning not to come back. However, police must have gotten a tip shortly after this, because they soon announced they believed she had been abducted. Although they never discussed what led them to this assertion, within the next few weeks, they would interview over 300 people, which is pretty significant considering the population was only around 4,000 people at the time. They soon found a potential lead, one that was kind of unexpected. A 43-year-old man named Patrick Michael Kahn was an individual that lived along June's post route. Now June would be threatened by this man, and she was terrified of him. Apparently at the time, the post office started cracking down on people who did not use their designated address assigned to their home. Now I don't know why Patrick or anyone would want to do this, but apparently it wasn't that uncommon to not use the address the post office gave you and just use something else. I assume something similar. Regardless, the post office for years had allowed it to slide, but began forcing their employees to not deliver any mail that was not sent to the designated address, which upset some citizens, particularly Patrick Kahn, who began shouting at her, and it scared her so much that she filed a complaint with the post office, which gave the police a good suspect to start with. They soon found out that not only did he shout at her in person, but he went to the post office and told her co-workers that he was going to kill her. So easy case, right? Well, first of all, they couldn't find this Patrick, but they assumed he was hiding out in his home state of Ohio, and they wanted to speak to him not just for June, but for a couple of other reasons. He was actually the prime suspect in a murder of a man named Donald Sewell, as well as being a suspect in a more perverse crime with an underage girl. Finally, about 6 months after June's disappearance, Patrick was found hiding out in Ohio and was extradited. And during the investigation, detectives soon established that Patrick had already been hiding out in Ohio when June disappeared, which basically ruled him out, although they still officially have him listed as a person of interest. Strangely, he was not convicted in the murder of Donald Sewell, but he did serve a 20-plus year sentence for the sexual crime. After this, they would find only one more lead, a TV repairman who had worked on June's television about a month before she disappeared. The TV was allegedly fixed, but still had issues, and when she told her sister Pat recommended she take it back to the man and tell him it still wasn't working. But June told her she would not go back because the man gave her an uneasy feeling, and she just did not want to ever have to deal with him again. Strangely enough, police did find this man in jail on drug charges, but they found nothing that could connect him to her disappearance. It's been over 2 decades since she vanished, and we still don't have a good idea of what exactly happened. There's no evidence that she left voluntarily or that she was abducted, although detectives do believe that is the case, stating that they narrowed down the initial suspect list of 40 down to 5 or 6 people. We also don't know what prompted June to go to the door. Was there a car that pulled up in the driveway and she seen the headlights prompting her to check? Or is it what the family believes? Her dog started barking and she stepped out to calm him down, something she did often. If that's the case, it has to mean that person had a ton of luck to just go by when she happened to step outside, or it means someone was stalking her. In either case, it's just bizarre how there were no footprints of anyone left around the home, or really any clue that she had even left. Hopefully, we can get a break on this one soon. September 6th, 2012, the Cibola National Forest in New Mexico. 2 friends decided to hike through a canyon area when they would decide to stop and take a little break around 11:30 a.m. The 2 friends had hiked the trail on many occasions and were very familiar with the area, and as a result, they were familiar with the dangers coming from the wildlife. In fact, there had just been new warnings posted for black bears seen in the area recently, and one of these hikers had even ran across one prior to this. There was also the occasional cougar sighting, and it might be that reason that, when a nearby bush began to shake, the 2 hikers got a little nervous, so they knew it was too small to be a bear, but could possibly be just the right size for a big cat. As they peered on, all of a sudden, a dark gray covered beast sprang out of the brush, snarling and growling, exposing its long, jagged teeth. This animal the 2 hikers had never seen before, but it sort of resembled a wolverine, except it was well over 100 pounds and was way taller than a wolverine. One of the hikers slowly picked up a rock just in case the animal decided to charge, They then stood nervously, staring at this beast for about 30 seconds before it quickly turned around and jumped back into the brush and moved away from the two. The hikers turned around immediately and backtracked to their truck quickly. It would be shortly after this that one of the hikers would speak to his neighbor who had hiked all over the Southwest and worked at Albuquerque Biopark, an environmental museum, and he began describing the animal to him. And the neighbor thought about it and told him that he probably just misidentified a small bear. The anonymous writer would close his email by stating he had contacted a few cryptid researchers about it and still did not have an answer. That story was sent to Fortean researcher, author, and publisher of the Phantoms and Monsters blog, a Lon Strickler, who had began looking into the Wolverine sightings in New Mexico. And guess what? That's out of their range. Wolverines live up north, mostly Canada and Alaska. So what was this creature? I mean, even if it was a Wolverine way out of its normal range, the fact is, they're only 25 to 40 pounds, significantly lighter than the 100-pound plus animal these hikers seen. But what if the account was faked, you may ask? While that's also possible, Lon Strickler did find something that may have given the sighting a little more credibility. Going back 4 years earlier, near Sandia Peak, New Mexico, about 3.5 hours away from Cibola National Forest, a 5-year-old boy was hiking with his family when an unidentified species of animal attacked him, and this animal was rather large. It happened when the boy ran out ahead of his parents, who then saw an animal they had never seen before, jump from the brush and start dragging their child away. The father charged the animal, which thankfully let go of the boy and fled. Rangers originally thought it was a mountain lion, and they were going to track the animal down. But something strange happened. Dogs were brought in that are specifically trained to hunt down cougars, and these dogs could never pick up a scent of a cougar in the area. This left wildlife experts to look at the animal's tracks that were left behind, and after studying them, they could not say what creature had left them behind. As far as the parents went, the dad could only give the description of a short, stocky, dark brown animal. Wildlife experts did state their belief that it was in fact a cougar, in spite of the fact that the dogs could never find a scent. They also theorized it was possibly a bobcat, coyote, or small bear. Strangely enough, the Wolverines' range did used to go down into New Mexico before trapping and habitat loss pushed them further north, but there are still some other people who have claimed to seen them. Regardless, there are no 100-pound Wolverines, and what these two anonymous hikers seen that day is still unknown. (1985) Grand Junction, Colorado. 47-year-old Bob White and an unnamed friend were traveling from Denver to Las Vegas when something extraordinary would happen. During their overnight drive on a large desolate highway, Bob would fall asleep in the passenger seat, only to be awoken by his friend sometime between 2 and 3 a.m. His friend, who was somewhat in an excited state, pointed out to a strange massive object in the distant sky. Bob must have thought he was dreaming, because he ignored his friend and fell fast asleep again, which prompted his friend to once again shake him and wake him back up. This time upon awaking, he knew he wasn't dreaming, but he still couldn't believe what he was looking at. The object had gotten closer, right up around 100 yards away from Bob, and the light was blinding. He would see shortly though, because after his friend flashed the headlights, the object would bolt up into the sky and connect with a pair of neon tubular lights, presumably from the mothership, which then sailed away east into the nighttime Colorado sky and slowly disappeared from the men's vision. Now that would be a strange enough paranormal mystery on its own, but it's what happened after this that gets it on this iceberg, because as this unidentified aircraft flew away, an orange light would fall from the craft to the ground. Bob and his friend would jump out of the car and run over to where this thing fell, and they seen soon enough that it was not actually orange colored. Instead, it was just red hot. The two men stood there a while and let it cool down, until they could finally reach down and pick it up and investigate it. The object was about 7.5 inches long and shaped like a teardrop. It had a coarse metallic exterior and weighed less than 2 pounds. looking sorta like a petrified pine cone, and was composed mainly of aluminum. Bob and his friend didn't know what to do, so they just threw it in the back of the trunk of the car and left. And after the ride, Bob would take this weird artifact with him, because Bob, knowing the experience he had just had, was certain this thing was extraterrestrial in nature. Was it simply a part that had snapped off of a UFO? Was it a locator probe? Bob did not know, but he was desperate to find out. And over the next several years, Bob would spend a lot of his own money trying to find out, taking it to different laboratories across the country, as well as conferences, spending over $60,000 worth of his own cash trying to identify exactly what it was that he found, but not with too much luck. He would send a sample to the National Institute for Discovery Science in 1996, who in turn sent it to the New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, whose testing found that it was nothing extraordinary or extraterrestrial, and instead was a mundane item that was similar to something called 360 aluminum casting alloy, which is a die casting alloy used in applications where resistance to corrosion is required. Although they did clarify that the testing they done was very little, because to them, it wasn't worth spending $1 million to run every available test they had because it simply didn't warrant it. Bob did not give up though, and reached out to another laboratory in California, who after testing, told Bob it was not extraterrestrial in nature. So what was it? Some scientists believe that the so-called lights in the sky that Bob and his friends seen was nothing more than a meteorite or space debris, like a satellite that is decaying, and that the artifact itself was also probably just space debris. Others believe that it is a metal buildup from a chop saw or grinder. When these metal particles are shaved off, they are red hot and land on each other in the same spot and start to stick to one another and create a stalagmite-looking piece of metal. Of course, that doesn't explain why it was laying out in the middle of a desolate area, red hot, on the night that Bob and his friend were driving through, assuming Bob is telling the truth. Regardless, to this day, no one is exactly sure what the item is. December 18th, 1998, Tacoma, Washington. 26-year-old Linda Tran would make her way over to her father's shop, something she did every noon to prepare lunch. As his home sat right next to his shop, she would bring her children along, 9-year-old Patricia and 22-month-old Austin, so they could play with their grandfather, Kit. Linda, who was pregnant at the time with her third child, was on her way to becoming a beautician as she took classes at a local cosmetology school, and she was very excited about the future. After arriving, Kit would offer to take them out to dinner that night to a well-known Vietnamese restaurant, and of course, Linda happily accepted. Unfortunately, a customer would unexpectedly show up to the auto shop, and Kit could not leave, instead staying to work on the vehicle. It was okay though, because Linda would walk over to her father's home and just start preparing dinner there, much to the 9-year-old Patricia's disappointment. Kit would then finish working on the vehicle and called it a day, and walked over to his home, where he joined his daughter and grandkids for dinner. Afterwards, he began watching TV, and Linda would tell her kids that it was time to go home, and again, to the disappointment of 9-year-old Patricia, who wanted to spend the night with her grandfather. But Linda told her no, because someone was bringing them Christmas presents by a week early, and Patricia and Austin would need to be there to open their gifts. Of course, this changed her mind, and she was ready to go, so the family took off back home around 7:45 p.m., stopping for just a minute to pick up some fruit from the store, and then going home. Now the exact time they made it is still unknown to this day, but her father lived around 10 minutes away, and with the stop at the store, it probably took about 15 minutes, putting their arrival around 8 p.m., and this would serve to be extremely important for the events that played out after, because at 8:15 p.m., just 30 minutes after she left her father's, frantic phone calls to 911 began pouring in. Several witnesses would report that Linda and her 2 small children were standing in their yard with a man none of the neighbors had ever seen before, and this suspicious encounter would turn deadly, as the man quickly pulled out a bat and chased Linda into her home, before turning back and ordering the children to go in behind her, crying all the way. He then shut the door behind them. Neighbors then began to hear shouting and crying coming from the home, accompanied by banging noises and glass breaking. Police were dispatched immediately, and on their way, they would be updated by the dispatcher, who said they received new reports that an explosion ripped through the house and flames were engulfing the duplex, and Linda and the kids were still inside. Now, what will really make this case crazy, and even more mysterious to this day, is police were dispatched at 8:15 and arrived at 8:25, and in that 10 minutes, the apartment was burning down, and no one seen Linda or her kids, and there were zero signs of the suspect. Within 5 minutes after the police arrived, the fire department showed up and got the fire under control. They then entered the home and sadly found that Linda, 9-year-old Patricia, and 22-month-old Austin were all deceased, along with Linda's unborn baby. But it would get sadder because an autopsy revealed that they had died from a combination of forced blunt trauma, smoke inhalation, and burns, suggesting they were still alive when the apartment was set ablaze. Detectives would close off the scene and began their investigation. And of course, obviously, the home had been intentionally burned. They found that it had some kind of accelerant poured all over the place, and then lit, no doubt, in an attempt to destroy evidence. And he accidentally poured too much, which is what caused the explosion and leads to the next confusing part of this mystery. The suspect was seen barely escaping out of the back door when the home exploded, ripping a hole in the roof and one of the walls, and this explosion would have no doubt injured or burned his back in his escape. Detectives then turned next to her neighbors in a hopeful attempt to learn more. The neighbors all conveyed they had never seen this man before, but they would give a pretty good description, which led to a sketch. They described him as being dark-skinned, either Asian or black, with a muscular build and around 30 to 35 years old. He also wore a knit cap and dark clothing. Other witnesses came forward and said the man ran to a dark-colored sedan where a driver was waiting on him, and they then fled the area, although not all witnesses could corroborate that part. The sketch was released to the public, and that led to nothing. And in what seemed like a sloppy crime that should have been easily solved, the detectives got nowhere. But they didn't give up, and they took a route that is normally taken in these investigations. They would turn their attention to Linda's love interest, past and present. They of course looked at her most recent boyfriend, who was the father of the child Linda was carrying, and police were able to definitively clear him, which led to past boyfriends, including the men that fathered her other 2 children. They too, after a thorough investigation, were cleared. However, there was one other man that Linda had dated in the past, and this man, her family was convinced, was the responsible party. They would bring up this person to detectives, who eventually found him. And again, after a thorough investigation, they were for sure this man was not involved, and they cleared him. Although police never divulged what it was that led them to dismissing all these early persons of interest, they were left with nothing to do but to look at other motives. Soon, they came across a rumor that the murders had been perpetrated due to unpaid gambling debts that Linda had. Of course, none of that ever really panned out either. Investigators were also interested in another odd fact that came out afterwards. Just the day before the murders occurred, someone had broken a window out of the back door to Linda's home. This was only discovered because Linda had told a cousin about it, who in turn told the police. Apparently, Linda had entered the home after, but seen no sign that anyone was there. In spite of this, police can never say for sure if they were linked, as it's possible that it was just a random break-in attempt. After this, the case went ice cold, and remains that way today, although they did take a look at evidence again in 2015 using modern techniques, and nothing came from it. Even though detectives were able to rule out any of her former love interest, they felt whoever had done this brutal crime had to have some kind of relationship with Linda. It didn't seem like a random crime. And I have to clarify here as well, although her boyfriend and past boyfriends were ruled out, the detectives did have struggles working this case because of the language barrier with the Vietnamese community. So I would be curious to see what actually led to those men being dismissed as suspects. And it's also odd that it seems like there's a ton of clues that should point to a perpetrator, like the person that bought Christmas gifts for the family, That's the whole reason Linda was in a rush to get back. But who was this person? And what was his connection to Linda? Was this some secret boyfriend police could never find? It's also odd that Linda told no one who this mystery gift giver was, instead just saying, someone is coming by with gifts. Furthermore, does that mean this suspect was intentionally trying to make sure the kids did show up, so they would be victims too? That seems odd and excessive. But the biggest question is the time frame. The first calls came in almost immediately, as there had been quite a disturbance created outside the duplex. 10 minutes later, the first police car arrives and the home is already on fire. And since none of the neighbors seen this man taking any accelerants with him, it's presumed he just used something on hand in Linda's home, which would be a huge risk to take, because you would think he wouldn't know that Linda had such accelerants in her home, and whatever it was would have to be in huge quantities, which made it kind of doubtful and makes it seem like he somehow got inside her home before she got there and had already doused it. I mean, maybe he got in from where he had tried to bust the door open the night before, assuming that was him. But that begs the question, if he had already broken in, why didn't he just wait inside and ambush her, instead of doing it outside in front of all the neighbors? Furthermore, did he just sit in the car with this driver with the bat in hand, waiting for her to arrive? And considering he almost certainly suffered burns to his back, did he ever check into a local hospital? Did he get treated somewhere else by a friend who had some medical training? Or did he go far out of town for treatment? March 4th, 1975, a man named Jim Sullivan was preparing to leave for Nashville, a place that some of the most famous musicians in the country come up. Jim, you see, was a singer/songwriter who grew up in San Diego, California, with big dreams of becoming a famous musician. In the mid-60s, he had minor success in a San Diego-based rock group called The Survivors, but he knew, just as his wife knew, that he would have to relocate to LA to have their best chance at success, and Jim and his wife Barbara would do just that in 1968. Barbara would even get a job as a secretary for Capitol Records, while Jim pursued his music career playing a ton of clubs in the evenings, and he must have felt pretty good about the future, because he did start making some crucial connections, like becoming friends with Dennis Hopper, which led to an unaccredited acting role in the film Easy Rider, while a lesser-known actor, Al Dobbs, heard Jim play at a club and believed he had the talent to make it. So he raised money for him to fund an album, and just a year later, Jim would release that album called UFO, which dealt with things like the supernatural and extraterrestrial themes, both subjects that Sullivan was very interested in. Unfortunately for Jim, the album tanked. It sold very few copies, in part because they did not have enough money to promote it. But Jim didn't give up, and 3 years later, he would release his second album, the self-entitled Jim Sullivan, which was produced by Playboy Records. It too tanked. This would ultimately lead to tension in Jim's relationship with his wife Barbara, and the two decided they should separate temporarily. The plan was for Jim to go to Nashville and hopefully establish a stable music career, where he would then send for his wife and 2 children. Which brings us back to the start of our story. Jim would depart from Nashville on March 4th, 1975, but it's what happens the following day that would put him into the mystery genre forever, because that day, Jim would call Barbara from Santa Rosa, New Mexico to let her know he was alright, although he'd only been gone for 1 day, so Barbara hadn't really thought that anything had went wrong. But then Jim began speaking a little mysteriously, and when she asked him what was up, he would say, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," which led Barbara to question if something was wrong. Jim would reply, "Forget I said anything, I'll call you from Nashville," and then hung up. Barbara thought it was weird, but she still did not begin to worry, until a few days went by and Jim had not checked in with her again. Now Barbara would start calling hospitals and the police in Santa Rosa. It's then that she would ask if Jim was in jail, and the officer replied, "No, but if you ask me, that's where he belongs," which is a curious answer. It might stem from the day that Jim had entered town on the 5th, because it was here he got pulled over for suspicion of DUI, but Jim passed the sobriety test and he was let go. From there, he would stop and buy some vodka and check into a hotel for the night. But here's where things would get even stranger, because after Barbara called the police, they would go to the motel and check in on him, only to find out that although Jim had been checked into this room for a few days, he had not even slept in the bed. And they also found out that on the 8th, just a few days after he had checked in, Jim's car had been towed away from a rural area about 24 miles south of town and this hotel, with only the guitar sitting in the front seat and his wallet, tapes, clothing, and LPs still inside. Other than that, there was nothing. Detectives were stumped, and this prompted Jim's brothers to enter town and begin their search, along with volunteers who came in to help out. But again, nothing was found. Detectives did search the nearby area where his vehicle was found, and the closest home was a ranch where a man named David Sena lived. He is believed to have been the last person to have spoke to Jim, and he had asked him if he needed a ride, which Jim declined, while a gas station attendant also told police that Jim had stopped in asking for directions back to California. And after this, the case quickly went cold. This aspiring up-and-coming musician with a fascination for UFOs somehow vanished in the middle of the New Mexico desert. Before long, theories began to pop up. Of course, there was alleged connections to the mafia that didn't shake out, or that perhaps he's seen something he shouldn't have, like a crime taking place, while the police themselves certainly looked suspicious considering the way the officer had talked badly about Jim upon taking Barbara's call. And of course, you can't leave out UFOs and aliens, which some ufologists suggest that's what Jim was trying to hide from Barbara in their last conversation, while more grounded theories hint that maybe Jim was suicidal since he struggled so much in the music business. There was also the fact that he actually developed an alcohol problem because of that, and at least one of Jim's friends recalled a conversation where Jim expressed his desire to walk out into the desert and disappear. It's also possible he just went to the desert to drink and clear his head, only to go for a walk and get lost, while some suggest that his disappearance is or was all a potential marketing ploy for his music career, but considering he never returned, that's unlikely. Regardless, none of these theories would ever be proven, and no one really could explain why he had driven to a remote area to begin with. "1917 Russia may be an odd place to start off a mystery based on Western American mysteries, but it's where we find ourselves, at the beginning of the Russian Revolution, which ended with the Russian Civil War in 1922, and it's during this time that, understandably, a lot of Russians just wanted to get away from the war and start over elsewhere, and in the 1920s, this led to a ton of immigration from Russia and Eastern Europe to America, which brings us to our woman of mystery, Lillian Alling. Not much is known about Lillian's childhood, or where she was even born, or when, but it was probably around 1900 in Russia, although some records point to Poland. Sometime in the 1920s, during the swell of immigration from Eastern Europe, she would arrive to Ellis Island intent on finding a home in America. And like a lot of the Russian families immigrating at this time, she came from an upper-class family, whom many were forced to flee. The people that would come into contact with Lillian at this time all reported she was well-educated and well-spoken. Now, records from this time period are somewhat hazy, but there's at least one report that states Lillian was actually sent by her family to find a new home first, and once she was established, the rest of her family would follow her over, but they never arrived because according to some accounts, her family would end up being thrown into exile in Siberia. But that might just be a tall tale to add to the mystery we're about to get into. Whatever the case may be, Lillian did miss her home, and she did not stay in the US very long when she decided she wanted to go back. For the people that knew her at this time, Lillian only stated her desire to go back was because she felt alone and unwelcome, and she probably missed her family. But although she wanted to go back home, it would not be as easy returning. After arriving in New York, she got a job as a maid, which was not a job that was going to allow her to save enough money to get a ticket to board a ship and return back to Europe. And again, because of scarce records, I could not find why her family was unable to get her the money she needed for the ticket, but it may be that they truly were exiled. Regardless, Lillian would not be deterred. She would go to the New York Public Library, go through maps of the US, Canada, and Siberia, and she plotted a course. Lillian decided she would walk home by going through British Columbia, the Yukon, Alaska, and then crossing the Bering Strait, somehow. Now, how she actually put this plan together and what happened in this time frame is lost, but the best guess is she departed in the spring of 1926 or 1927, heading west along the highways that had just been built for automobiles, which were now becoming the norm. She would first go to Buffalo before crossing into Canada at Niagara Falls on Christmas Eve. It's here the customs officials would ask her routine questions, and she would reply that she was born in Poland and was 30 years old. The records, as mentioned, are pretty bad, but we know that some people reported seeing her in Chicago, Minneapolis, and Winnipeg, where she held jobs in restaurants, as well as working on farms in Canada. And by September 10th, 1927, she had reached the western border of Canada, and it's here she would meet a telegraph lineman at a cabin of the Yukon Telegraph Trail, a 1,000-mile path to Canada's far north. This man would notice her tattered clothing, malnourished appearance, and numerous swollen insect bites, and he spoke to her. When he found out that she was planning to walk to Siberia, he radioed ahead of her to the southern trailhead because he was really concerned for her. This prompted a constable, a J.A. Wyman, to intervene, knowing the winter would kill someone walking on foot, and that allowing her to go would be unethical. So he took her back to Hazleton, where she begged to be allowed to keep going, but she would be arrested and charged with vagrancy and was searched, and she was found to be carrying an iron bar, which she stated was to protect herself from men. She then spent the next 2 months in jail, which was basically a way just to give her shelter. And then after she was released, she took a job at a Vancouver restaurant where she saved up the money to depart by the end of May or June 1928. By this time, her story was well known to Canadian law enforcement, who insisted she stop at cabins on the Telegraph Trail, which are placed 30 miles apart and would allow her to get food and clothing and any assistance she needed. She would also be gifted a dog that traveled with her for a while, until it died, probably from ingesting poison left out for Wolverines, but Lillian would have it stuffed and carried it along with her. By 1929, she saved the money to purchase and repair a boat, which she planned to sell the Yukon to Alaska later that year, and she did just that, taking it to the Seward Peninsula, where she abandoned the boat and walked to Nome, Alaska. And it's in Alaska, our western state, that the mystery would unfold, because once she reaches Nome, she basically disappears. Her last official sighting was outside Teller, Alaska, a small town part of the greater Nome area, and it's here she was seen by an Inuit person who recorded that Lillian was pulling a contraption like a cart containing her few possessions. On top of the pile sat a weird-looking thing like the body of a black and white dog, no doubt the one she had stuffed. A decade later, a couple named Bill and Ruth Albee would follow Lillian's Alaskan route in 1940 and wrote about their experience, and they claimed from what they could find, Lillian's tracks did end at the edge of a swollen river, where it was thought that she had drowned. This was corroborated by the Inuit witness account, which would mean she had walked at least 5,000 miles before meeting a terrible accident. However, some doubt this account and believe a happier ending occurred. Even though relations between the US and Soviet Union were beginning to sour by this point, the native Inuit people still traveled across the Bering Strait each year between June and November when the water was ice-free. Both countries pretty much just ignored it, and since it was so common, Lillian could have potentially paid for passage back to Russia with one of these Inuit travelers, but if she made it, there's no actual record of it, although there was at least one claim that she was spotted by a Russian soldier in Providenia with 3 Inuit men, and they were being interrogated by Soviet officials. She allegedly told them that she had left America to walk home to Russia because she had been unable to find friends or work, and that not one person helped her on her journey. which was certainly a lie if this was really Lillian saying this. This would be about 150 miles west of Nome. Of course, no one can verify if that was really her or not, and so we don't really know how her story ended. Did she make it back to Russia, or Poland, or wherever she truly lived in Eastern Europe? Or did she drown in the attempt after making the arduous journey of 5,000 miles? It would be very disappointing to think so. September 24th, 1911, Ten Sleep, Wyoming. At the Red Bank Ranch, a 17-year-old, Rhoda Spees, and her friend, Mary Ribideau, were sent out on an errand from the main ranch headquarters to another cabin known as the Canyon House. It is here the former governor, William Richards, lived with his daughter and son-in-law, 21-year-old Edna Jenkins and 22-year-old Thomas Jenkins. Now William, he was out of town on a hunting trip, but these girls had been sent to check on the newly wedded couple, as no one had heard from them in a couple of days. As they got closer, they were struck by something odd. Their cabin was eerily dark and silent. But it wasn't just that. As they passed the corral and barn, they noticed the door was wide open, which was typically not the case. As they passed on by, trying to make sense of the mysterious situation, they suddenly seen 3 horses dash out and run away. It was pretty dark, and Mary was unsure, but she could have swore she seen a man running out behind the horses. Not knowing exactly what was going on, the brave girls continued to ride forward, until Rhoda's horse bucked up on her and refused to go any further, seemingly afraid to walk past a certain tree. Strangely, the tree had something bundled lying underneath, which neither of the girls could identify because the light from the day was fading. But it's probably what spooked Rhoda's horse. Unable to go any further, Mary tried to ride on up. Her horse was much calmer and actually kept on walking, and she made it to the back door of the cabin. Since both girls were here often, she knew that there were always fresh drinking water, which was kept in 2 buckets on a bench just inside the door. As she made her way up, she noticed it was too dark to see inside, but she felt around in the bucket for the dipper and found one of the buckets empty, and the other only had warm, stale water. The girls now found themselves in a peculiar situation, and the only thing Mary could think to do was to go back to the tree to see what that was laying underneath it, since Rhoda's horse was still too spooked to go. So Mary would get closer and closer, while Rhoda's horse kept dancing around. Mary then caught sight of something that shook her up. What she thought was a random bundle was a human body, a deceased body. She was now scared, and with the light fading quickly, she didn't get a great look, but she suspected that it was an Indian. She quickly jumped on her horse, and both her and Rhoda took back off at full speed towards the headquarters. Now the next part is a little strange, because when the 2 girls told the men about what they had seen, they didn't seem to be interested in going to check everything out. I couldn't find out why that was. Maybe it's because the girls thought it was an Indian, or maybe because the light was fading. Regardless, they would put a party together and leave a few hours later at about 8:30 p.m. And sure enough, when they got to the tree, they found the dead body. And it was that of Edna Richards Jenkins, who, as I mentioned previously, was the daughter of the former governor of Wyoming, William A. Richards. And the cabin that Mary had checked for water earlier was owned by him. What was strange was Edna's husband, Thomas Jenkins, was nowhere to be found. The 2 had only been married for 4 months, but I'm sure, considering the situation, everybody was suspicious of him at first. But when they walked into the house, they found Thomas had been shot through the heart and was lying on a bare mattress on the bedroom floor. Mary's body, on the other hand, had 3 bullet wounds, 1 in her temple and a couple in her chest. The strangest part was the pistol was sitting in her left hand, and another one was laying next to her body. And it's also important to point out now, she was right-handed. After studying the scene and taking the 2 bodies to the coroner, Edna's father, the former governor, William, was sent a telegram. He had been out of town hunting and would immediately make the long trip back home via automobile, which was still something new to the world and not incredibly fast. Since this was way in the early days of criminal investigation and out in the middle of nowhere, police had no idea where to start, nor did it help that there just wasn't much evidence of what exactly happened. But the fact that Edna's father was a former governor, well, resources would be allocated to find the murderer. And you may think this sounds like a simple murder-suicide, and that's actually what the first coroner's jury found. But their theory was really kinda insane. Their finding was the two had gotten into an argument, and then Thomas shot Edna twice in the lungs, which incapacitated her. Thomas then felt guilty about what he had done, went inside the home, set his mattress on fire, laid down, and pulled the trigger. About this time, Edna would regain her composure, stumble to the home, seen the mattress on fire, took water from the bucket and put the fire out, then, seeing she was too late, grabbed both guns, walked outside to the tree where she ended her own life, which you have to admit seems like a huge stretch. This might be why the local newspapers suggested the two had made a pact to end it together, which also seems strange that one did it in the bedroom and the other one did it out in the yard. Regardless, as crazy as that sounded, there was some evidence to back it up. Or maybe I should say, lack of evidence. Like, there were no footprints in the area other than Edna and Thomas, nor were there any signs that any other person had been here in a while. Meanwhile, Edna's father, the former governor, would return and start his own investigation and released a statement to the press which said he did not accept the coroner jury's verdict because there was no evidence that suggested that either Edna or Thomas had planned this. In fact, William had been living with the couple in that cabin for a while and knew their habits. Actually, it was him that was able to come up with the time for the murders because he knew when they had done their chores. He pointed out the laundry had been cleaned but was still damp, which meant they would be ironed Saturday morning, just like the bread they made on Friday afternoon was still setting out, where it had been left to cool, leading him to the conclusion that this happened sometime between Friday afternoon and Saturday morning. But he also noted there had been no trouble from the couple leading up to this, and soon investigators found letters from Edna to Thomas, as well as her father, and both were happy and affectionate in tone. But what really tipped the scales was when investigators found 2 more bullets in the bedroom wall and 3 in the living room. One of these had been fired through a portrait of Edna. There was also the fact that cash and jewelry had been missing, and thinking back, why was the barn door opened? And was that a man that really ran out behind the horses? Because of all these new findings, another coroner's jury was held, this time about 2 months after the crime, and they released a new verdict. Edna and Thomas both died at the hands of a person or persons unknown. In addition to the bullet holes found, authorities had other evidence which was not made public until the former governor got involved, and he made it go public. Like, Edna's right shoulder had the imprint of a heavy hand with a thumb on front and 4 fingers on the back, which clearly left spots on her skin. The bone above her left eye had also been broken and indented by a blow from a smooth object or instrument, which never broke the skin. She had also been wearing a nightgown with her bathrobe over it, and there were 2 bullet holes in the gown, but not in the robe. In addition, her legs had been cut and scratched and had been bleeding, and the ball of one toe was completely torn off. Yet, she had knee-length stockings on that were undamaged. And maybe the most crazy part, there was no blood under the tree where Edna was found laying. But that's not the only oddity. The carpet underneath the bed, as well as the mattress on the floor, was absolutely soaked with water, which, as mentioned earlier, probably came from the empty bucket of water that Mary had found upon first arriving, and it was probably used to throw onto the mattress, which appeared as if it had been set on fire. Richard's notes on this investigation, which we still have, also pointed out he had unloaded 3 revolvers which were at the cabin before he went out of town on his hunting trip. Yet, when he got back and did his investigation, he found that all the cartridges had been reloaded, which he suggested meant that Edna and Thomas were afraid of someone. He also had an answer for the mattress being on the floor. That simply meant they were trying to stay out of sight of the nearby window, or they wanted to be able to escape quickly. Although, it has to be pointed out that some accounts say the bed had been made up but not laid on, while other accounts claim the mattress was bare. The investigation went nowhere for a while, but they would soon catch a break, because a newspaper subscription salesman and reporter named Edward T. Payton would randomly show up in the vicinity of the ranch and was, quote, clearly out of his head and caused so much trouble that the sheriff was notified. It should be noted, Peyton had been in and out of the mental state hospital 4 separate times and was known to have fits of mental illness, but it's during this episode specifically that he would constantly mutter about the dead woman and made other remarks that detectives found suspicious, which they never divulged what these comments were. It also looked pretty suspicious because he had attacked Governor Richards in newspaper columns in the 1894 election and accused him of fraudulent land deals, although that was never proven. Regardless, he was known to hate the governor. He would be the only person ever arrested in connection with the case, but no evidence against him was found, and questioning didn't really lead to anything, so he was released a couple of weeks later. Then, 2 other men were also briefly suspected, a O.K. Fullerton, who was a handyman that did odd jobs around the ranch. He was said to be attracted to Edna and was widely known to be a thief in the area, while a Tom O'Day had been in a gang and served time in prison, and that gang had frequently traveled along a trail that went by the ranch, and allegedly O'Day had been spotted there or near there on the day of the murder, but there was no real evidence that he was connected to the crime, and T2 was soon forgotten about. And that's pretty much it. The case was never solved, and it's one of the most perplexing in the history of Wyoming, not only due to the fact that one of the victims was the daughter of a governor, but because of the other oddities. No footprints, yet Edna's body had been moved, but Thomas could not have moved her because there was no gun in the room for him to have ended his own life. So who put Edna's robe on? Why did they put the gun in her left hand when she was right-handed? How did the mattress catch fire? Or, if someone did set it on fire, why throw water all over it afterwards? Who shot the portrait? And maybe most importantly, did Mary, the young girl, really see a man fleeing out of the barn behind the horses? Or was the light from the dusk playing tricks on her eyes? That's something she could never answer for the rest of her life. February 9th, 1964, Nampa, Idaho. It was during the late night hours of 1:30 to 2 a.m. when a resident of Sherman Avenue would see the headlights roll in. Across the street was 51-year-old neighbor Lillian Richey. She had just came back from a nightclub in Garden City, about a 25-minute ride away. The neighbor would then strangely see Lillian's car back out of the driveway and be driven away by a man. The neighbor now at this point had seen the kitchen light in Lillian's home turned on, so he thought nothing else of it. But it would be 2 days later, when Lillian was scheduled to show up for work, that she didn't arrive, and people began to wonder. And they soon put it together that no one had heard from her in a couple of days. Part of the reason for this was Lillian lived alone as she was a widow, and her 2 sons were adults and had moved out long ago, and they didn't even live nearby. Regardless, the police were notified, and they soon went over to do a wellness check on Lillian. And now, strangely, her car was back in the driveway, but she was not there. The door was unlocked, and the officers walked in and found nothing out of the ordinary. No sign of forced entry or a struggle. But they did find a note, which strangely read, "Dear Lillian, have been here since 11. Have looked for a note and haven't found a thing. I don't know what to think. Have gone to Harmony Cafe to have breakfast. Then plan to go to John Yoder for a short time." The note was then signed at the bottom, and this signature has long been a source of discussion, since it's kinda hard to make out what it says exactly. One blog, which discusses missing person cases, has made the argument that the signature was Arthur Tooby, coincidentally a California cattle rancher and member of a cattlemen's association, which will be important later on. But no one is certain if that is the name. I mean, to me it looks like it says Kurt Tosley, but what do I know? But here's where things get strange. Police would actually find this man, and they've never publicly identified him, which I will tell you why in a second. And they didn't disclose how they tracked him down, but upon finding him, they began to fill in the blanks. They wanted to know what had happened the night before last when he had went out with Lillian. And according to him, he was actually from California and had came to Boise to attend a cattle convention. And in that time frame, he met up with Lillian. Now, had he known her before this, or was this the first time meeting her? That is unknown. But that evening, they would go to a club together where they stayed out to about 1 a.m. or so, and he took her back home. And it was here he would drop her off and leave, as she had allowed him to borrow her car, which was confirmed by what the neighbor had seen that night. As to how the car got back in the driveway, well, the next morning, they had planned to meet about 11 a.m. where he would drop the car off and have breakfast with her, and he was going to bring along a male friend. And this other man, we know even less about. But when they got there that next morning to drop it off, they saw the garage door open, and when they got up to the door and knocked, nobody answered, so they went inside. They walked around and called for her, and she never replied. Soon, he would write the note and leave, and that was basically it. Now obviously, you know these guys would be the top suspects, but that ended up not being the case. The police grilled these two extensively, but they were cooperative, and eventually completely cleared, much to the investigators' own frustration. Going so hard after these two was basically a waste of time, but it wasn't just the questioning of them that allowed them to rule them out. Nah, there were other things that went against them. Like, Lillian had wore a black evening wrap around her dress that evening, and when she got back home, she left it there, along with basically everything else she had, even a plane ticket she was going to use to visit her sons later that month. But what was missing made it even more perplexing. Although her purse was left behind, a few items from it had been taken. There was also a green and brown plaid dress that had been removed from the closet, and this was not the same dress that she had worn to the club, which was a black cocktail dress. On top of that, there was a different purse which was missing, and was possibly used to carry the missing items from the other purse. And finally, a book called A Man Named Peter, the #1 seller in 1951, was also missing, and that's pretty much it. The case went cold before the end of the year and didn't have any movement on it whatsoever for the next 60 years. Her sons had even hired private investigators over the decades, and they too never found anything. There was just no evidence of a break-in or anything that suggested she was attacked or abducted. There was some slight movement in 2018 when the local police performed a new search, even digging for her remains under the school administrative office, after hearing rumors that her body had been buried there. But it ended up being just rumors. And as far as the two men go, obviously, their names were protected once they were determined to not be suspects. Actually, they weren't even considered persons of interest. And that name, Arthur Tooby, if that's what the signature says, he was just a cattleman that lived a very normal law-abiding life. So what actually happened? Well, there's not a lot of theories on this one. It's one of the more bizarre cases we have ever covered. One theory you can find suggested is accidental death. Lillian most likely had alcohol at the club, and maybe she was disoriented and fell, and ended up with a head injury. This one is very possible, but where did she go? And shouldn't someone have found her? And how far could she have gotten if she was that drunk? But it makes more sense than an abduction, since there was no sign of a struggle. Some obviously still believe the men were involved, but police were confident they weren't. Sadly, this case will probably never be solved. April 20th, 1890, Tombstone, Arizona, home of the very famous gunfight at the OK Corral, plays host to this next very weird cryptid mystery. It all started when two ranchers were returning from a trip to the Huachuca Mountains about 40 miles away, and when traveling through this desert landscape, they came across one of the most bizarre creatures we have ever looked at. According to the men, resting on the sand-covered floor was an animal resembling an alligator with an extremely long tail and giant wings. The creature, upon spotting them, began flapping its wings in an attempt to escape, and it did make it up into the air, although briefly, before it came back down to the ground. Whatever this thing was, it seemed to be very exhausted and was only capable of making short flights, or at least, that's all it was capable of by the time these men had found it. These men, by the way, were totally shocked and for a few seconds just watched it, before the ranchers regained their composure and, rifles in hand, rode after the beast. They would actually chase it for several miles, while the cryptid would make a series of short flights over and over trying to escape them. Finally, the men closed in and opened fire on the creature, which was much larger than they first thought. It was gigantic. The cryptid, although in pain, turned towards the men and prepared to attack, but because it was so exhausted, could never get close enough to them. The men continued to shoot the animal, which then rolled over and stopped moving. The men were stumped. What had they shot? The two would get closer and began to examine it. From head to the tip of its tail, it was a staggering 92 feet long, while its greatest diameter was just over 4 feet. The wingspan was an insane 160 feet from tip to tip, and the wings were transparent like membranes. The creature only had 2 feet, which sat about a yard in front of where the wings were attached. The head itself was about 8 feet long, and its jaws contained thick, straight, sharp teeth. Its eyes were also estimated to be about the size of a dinner plate, and they protruded out of the head. They also noted that the animal had no hair or feathers, just smooth skin, which of course was no help against gunfire. It would be 5 days later when the ranchers finally made it back to Tombstone, and that's when one of the men would go share his story with the town, and he also let them know he planned to skin the monster and bring it in. And the following day, the story would make it to the local newspaper, which also stated that several of the prominent men from the area were going to try and bring the body back to town before it was skinned, and then send it back to the east for scientists to examine. And sadly, like a lot of weird cases from this time, there was never a follow-up. However, although the article didn't cause shockwaves across the country, a few papers around California picked up the story, and a couple of months later, articles began popping up in Kansas newspapers, and presumably other Midwestern states. Now typically, I would wrap this one up and go straight to the theories, with the main one being that this was a total fabrication by the newspaper, which was not unusual for this time frame, because they were widely known to publish these crazy fictional tales about monsters, airships, etc., just to boost circulation. But this one is a little bit different, because although the story was quickly forgotten, it would be over 70 years later, in 1963, when the story would get a bit of a resurgence. It came about in a magazine article by Jack Pearl entitled "Monster Bird That Carries Off Human Beings." As you can guess, the article was more fiction than fact, and that's because he was essentially just writing his article based on letters by a man named Hy Cramner, who had a theory that Thunderbirds, which had came from Native American legends, were possibly evidence for modern reportings of pterodactyls. And one of these stories he mentioned in particular was our story of the 1890 Tombstone Monster. Now what makes this one interesting is Cramner's letters, as well as Pearl's article, tells a slightly different story. It claims that it did not happen in 1890, but in 1886, and it only states that it was an odd but giant bird that they had shot. And the most important part was that the animal was then nailed up to the wall of the Tombstone Epitaph building, the newspaper place. And then its picture was taken, and it was nowhere near the 160 feet from wingtip to wingtip. Instead, it was 36 feet, and the photo showed 6 men with their outstretched arms touching lined up under the bird to show how big it was. Pearl would finish his segment by stating that according to the original records, all the men knew the bird was actually a pterodactyl. Now you may have heard this story before, but if you haven't, this would end up leading to one of the biggest mysteries in cryptid history, the legendary Lost Thunderbird photo, with numerous people claiming to have seen this old photo in a magazine or a book, but for whatever reason, it has been lost. Interestingly, Pearl's article did not have the picture, nor did Cramner, the writer of the letters so much of this article was based on. But that's because there were no photos in the original newspaper which told the story of the Tombstone Monster, and the only illustrations were black and white block prints and etchings. Photos were most likely not feasible for this small town newspaper, as it's doubtful they had the equipment to do it. But here's where the problem lies. This was 2 separate stories, one being the 1886 case of the 36-foot flying creature said to be a pterodactyl, which was shot, and then a photo may or may not have been taken and might be lost, versus our story of the 1890 monster. And all of this confusion is because of the 1963 article by Pearl, which led to people believing that the photo of this bird that is missing is actually of the case that we are discussing, the 1890 mystery of the Tombstone monster. Further confusing things is sometimes the story was said to have taken place as early as 1882 or as late as 1901. And that's why I don't want to discuss the photo portion of this mystery that much. It's way too confusing, and honestly, there's a ton of videos on YouTube that explain the story much better. The part I want to focus on solely is the event in 1890. Did these men really shoot down some flying reptile creature whose wingspan was well over 100 feet? If so, what was it? The most likely scenario is that it was just sensationalist journalism to sell a newspaper, which was mixed in with the Native American folklore of thunderbirds. It's also possible they misidentified a real animal, such as the California condor, whose wingspan can get close to 10 feet. But maybe that one's not as likely. Either way, it's a very confusing case. September 4th, 1964, Cisco Grove, California. 28-year-old Donald Schrum and a group of friends decided to go bow hunting, but unfortunately for Donald, at some point during the hunt, he became separated from the rest of the party and could not find his friends. As the evening turned to night, Donald knew he would have to find some kind of way to remain safe, so he climbed up a tree where he planned to sleep for the night. However, this wouldn't be as safe as he thought it would, because as he got comfortable and began to drift off, a white light at a low altitude began to zigzag through the trees. This relieved Donald, of course, because he thought it was a rescue helicopter that was searching for him. So he jumped down from the tree, pulled out his flares, and began lighting them, in hopes of trying to capture the attention of the pilot overhead. As soon as he done this, the light would turn towards him and came to a stop about 50 yards away. Donald then waited as the craft slowly lowered to the ground, but as it got closer, he soon realized it was not a helicopter. Donald would go on to describe it as cigar-shaped and the size of a 14-story building. As this craft hovered, a smaller scout aircraft would exit the larger one and then land nearby. Of course, this frightened Donald, who immediately began climbing back up into the tree. From here, he recalled that 3 beings would get out of the aircraft and approach the trees. 2 of them were humanoids, a little over 5 feet tall, with silvery uniforms that covered their heads and wearing something similar to welding goggles. As the 3rd being approached, Donald would state it looked more like a sci-fi robot. He was darker in color and had 2 reddish-orange eyes. In the place where it would typically have a mouth, he seen a slit-like opening that would drop down like the door of an oven. Donald began to panic because now all 3 beings were down below him, and they grabbed the tree and began shaking it in an attempt to throw him out. Donald described vividly that the robot entity would lower its jaw and then a rectangular gap would emit a puff of smoke in his direction. This smoke would spread out like a mist and cause Donald to lose consciousness as it reached him. And if you're thinking Donald would come to and see that these alien beings were gone, well, think again, because they were still below him shaking the tree. That's when Donald started to get nauseous. But you see, he came up with a quick plan. He would take extra bits of clothing, light it, and then throw it down at them, which did actually make them back off, although only for a short time, before coming back and shaking the tree again. Donald studied the situation carefully, and that's when he started to speculate that audio signals from the UFO seemed to be directing these aliens. He then thought maybe the best course of action was to shoot an arrow at these things, and he did just that. The first arrow hit one and a spark came off of it, indicating that they were indeed metallic. He would shoot 2 more times, which caused the beings to scatter. However, this was not the end, because now a second robot left the aircraft and made its way to the tree, where it emitted a white vapor which caused Donald to lose consciousness a second time. When he awoke, he saw 2 of the humanoids were now climbing the tree, so he began throwing things at them to slow them down. This would go on all night long, and by the early morning, more humanoids arrived, and after another batch of smoke, Donald passed out one final time, and he woke up to see all the aliens were now gone. But unfortunately for Donald, he had been tied up to a tree by his belt. His friends by this point had also located him, and they helped him get out of the tree. And if you would think nobody would believe this story, one of these other hunters had also gotten lost, and he would confirm he had seen the same UFO, but he had never seen the aliens. Once untied, Donald would collect all of his belongings from the ground that he had tossed out at the invaders the night before. Then he sought medical attention for possible radiation exposure, but was determined to be okay. Eventually, the events would reach the McClellan Air Force Base, who contacted him and arranged a secret meeting to take place in an empty house off base. They would take the arrows, which still had metal shavings on it from the robot, and they began to pressure Donald to doubt his memory, and they offered up other explanations for him to choose from. He eventually agreed because he was afraid, and stated he didn't know what it was he had actually seen, but he did stick to the same story for the next 50 years. And that's pretty much it. A crazy story. But what really happened? Let's start with the obvious. It was really alien visitors from another planet, or even another star system. The sophisticated technology would point towards this. Things like the cigar-shaped UFO, scout aircrafts, and the vapor emitters are pretty advanced. And a lot of ufologists point to this case as being one of the more important ones in UFO history. Others suggest secret military technology, like drones, which would have been really advanced for the early 60s. However, the most plausible explanation is something psychological. Maybe him being lost caused immense fear, and the isolation caused something like sleep paralysis, which led to hallucinations, although the arrows with metallic sparks would seem to rule that out, if they exist. Overall, a very crazy case. The Bermuda Triangle, the Bennington Triangle, and the Alaskan Triangle are all mysterious locations where spooky disappearances have occurred. The areas are generally defined as a triangle, obviously, and while those are the three most popular in North America, did you know there is one maybe creepier than all three, located right in New Mexico, and it's known as the Pecos Triangle, a place where people are swallowed up whole and never seen again. The area is largely made up of thick woods from the Carson and Santa Fe National Forest, roughly 224,000 acres, and while not strictly a triangle, it had been given the nickname due to the oddities which have occurred there. Now, before we dive into what makes this range mysterious, I have to point out that the Pecos Triangle doesn't even lead the state in disappearances. That belongs to the northwest corner of New Mexico in Navajo Nation. But even the Gila Wilderness, especially the Black Range and the Mazzano Mountains, have as much or more disappearances than Pecos. The difference is, the Pecos Triangle has many more missing person cases where there's no clear resolution as to what had happened. They usually follow a similar pattern. The victim gets separated from the group and vanishes, and then when a search party arrives, they find footsteps that stop suddenly, and dogs just abruptly lose their scent. Most of these people are never found, but some of them are eventually, although it's usually months later, and in most cases, they are found unclothed and severely injured, but deceased from exposure to the elements. Another trait these people share is that most of them were experienced outdoorsmen who are physically fit, while others are actually found way off the road in their vehicles, nowhere near their intended route. Basically, this is an area that has cases that skew heavily towards the 411 type, and that's the basic description of this area. But what good does that do unless we discuss some of the key cases? Now, these aren't going to be deep dives, but brief summaries to show the pattern. First, Melvin Needle, a 61-year-old bow hunter who, on September 6, 2009, at around 4:30 p.m., told his friends at campsite he was going down the trail just a little ways and would come back. And he never did. He was in great physical condition to be 61. He actually owned a Pilates gym and was a popular fitness instructor, on top of being an outdoorsman. He had actually gotten lost in the woods once before, and it frightened him, and because of that, he usually carried his GPS with him while he was out in the woods, and he would never go far from the campsite, Making it even stranger was when searchers arrived, the dogs quickly picked up his scent on the trail that he had taken, and they followed it for 50 yards before it just stopped. No remains were ever found. Then there's 50-year-old Stanley Virgil, who again was hunting with friends and broke off on his own, and a while later, his friends heard him fire 2 shots. They assumed he had gotten a deer, but when they searched for him, they could not find him. So they fired off a sounding shot into the air and waited, and then Stanley responded with a shot of his own, but this time, he was further away than the first 2 shots. Unfortunately, snow and fog came into the area, and his friends knew that they would never find him, so they called search and rescue. The dogs were never able to pick up a scent. Some sources say he was spotted on a trail cam at a ranch about 9:30 that night, bundled up against the cold, while some sources say he knocked on the door of a mobile home where the resident was a woman with kids and she turned him away. Whatever the case, his remains were eventually found by an off-duty cop who was fishing. His ribs had been smashed and his head had signs of trauma, yet his death was caused by drowning. Then there's the cases of the unidentified. The Mora County John Doe was found in Wagon Mound in 2015 and was basically just a few bones by that point. The deceased was thought to be a white male between 25 and 40, and whoever he was, he came super prepared. He had a backpack with a sleeping bag, flashlight, garbage bag, extra clothes to keep warm, and all of this stuff was pretty expensive, along with his expensive sunglasses. It's believed he was an avid outdoorsman, but how he ended up here and why he was never reported as missing is still unknown. There are several more examples like the previous ones, but obviously, we can't go over every one of them, since our mystery is more about the location. And that leads us to the theories. Is this area really a place where several disappearances take place due to unexplained phenomena? Obviously, the most likely theory is just disorientation and the rugged terrain. Even experienced outdoorsmen can get lost in this area, where much of the terrain looks identical to areas you already passed through. The landmarks become impossible to go by, and the area is known to be hit with unpredictable weather like fog or very cold nights, on top of the limited water supply, and all that makes it very dangerous. There's also the fact that the scent trails the dogs lose are because of the factors like wind or other animal activity in the area. There's also the issue that sometimes people just decide to do something they normally wouldn't do, like separating from the group, and then they end up making a mistake and it just cascades into bigger and bigger mistakes until it ends with their demise. But for many, they still believe the answer is paranormal activity. Maybe something like mysterious energy fields popping up, or maybe an electromagnetic disturbance which disorients people, or maybe they just walk into some portal. Some even suggest skinwalkers, aliens, shadow people, or many other varying types of supernatural explanations. September 2000, Calgary, Alberta, Canada, is an odd place to start a mystery that would occur in Nevada, but that's exactly where we find 28-year-old truck driver Trevor Angell. Trevor was a Canadian citizen whose primary route saw him making deliveries to different parts of the western United States and bringing goods back to Canada. But Trevor, who had been driving for a few years by this point, was beginning to get tired of life on the road, which was in no part motivated by the fact that he now had a small child at home along with his wife, both whom he desired to spend more time with. He would contemplate for a while about his future employment and would inform his wife and family that after this last trip to Los Angeles, where he was to deliver a load of meat and then return with bananas from the US, he was calling it quits. This was going to be his last ride. With that said, on September 20th, he jumped in his truck and headed off. The next day, he would arrive in Los Angeles after 25 hours of driving and would then offload the goods and get the return shipment to take back to Calgary. But on his way back, though, he would come up on a small Nevada border town called Primm, a place he was familiar with and stopped every time he came through, because Trevor liked to visit the casino and hotel there, and it wasn't just him. This was a place where a lot of truckers would stop and drink, gamble, or just rest. It's the following day, though, that took an interesting turn, because Trevor would call back home to his wife and tell her some alarming news. He would say he hadn't slept in 4 days. This, of course, led his wife to encourage him to try and lay down and get some rest. Now, whether he did or not is unknown, but it would be later that same day that Trevor's parents got a concerning phone call as well. This time, it was from representatives of the trucking company that Trevor worked for, and they wanted to know why Trevor wasn't answering his phone, and if he was okay, because their company GPS indicated he was still parked in Prim. Was Trevor still asleep, or just gambling it up and didn't care because this was his last ride? No one knew for sure, but 3 days later, when Trevor had still not came home or contacted his family, everyone got worried, and he would be reported as missing to the police. Detectives, for their part, at least knew where to start, because his company truck was still sitting in the same exact parking spot it had been the whole time. So they went to the casino, where they found the truck, opened the door, and looked inside. There sat Trevor's wallet, which still contained his credit cards, ID, but no cash. More concerning was there were no signs of Trevor. This was perplexing, but police would begin trying to trace down his movements over the past few days, and they would start back at the 22nd, when he had last called his wife and told her he had not slept in 4 days. Turns out, multiple people saw Trevor gambling at the casino that day. Investigators would discover something else as well. Up until 4 a.m. the following morning, Trevor's debit card was used a total of 9 times, withdrawing all the money from his entire paycheck. Detectives and his family were no doubt concerned now for his safety. Had someone hurt him and stole his debit card and wiped out his money? Well, there were problems with that line of thinking. Like, why was the debit card still found in his wallet? It makes it seem like Trevor took all the money out himself. That looked even more so the case when investigators found a waitress who had served Trevor breakfast at 10 a.m., just 6 hours after his bank account had been cleared out. Here, Trevor ordered oatmeal and then paid for it with pocket change. That wouldn't be the last sighting, though. It would be later that day when another witness would see him walking around in the parking lot, looking disheveled and disoriented. He also clutched his stomach and was asking passerbys for help. After that, the trail went cold for about a year. It would be in December of 2001 the witnesses in Texas would call in and report seeing Trevor. However, these sightings were never confirmed, and it's unsure if he actually got to Texas. In any event, that was 2 decades ago, and he's never been seen again. So what happened? Well, much has been made about Trevor telling his wife he hadn't slept in 4 days, although some sources state that he had actually told another trucker that on the radio. Regardless of which, it has led to much conjecture that Trevor was on meth. In fact, if you remember, he drove 25 hours straight from Calgary to Los Angeles, probably very difficult to do without the aid of some kind of stimulant. Then, there is the witness who had seen him clutching his stomach and asking people for help in the parking lot. It seems like Trevor may have suffered some sort of medical event, maybe all the sleep deprivation, plus possible drinking for the casino, which he was known to do, and the stimulants triggered some kind of collapse. Or maybe he was hallucinating, leading him to wander off into the desert and die, and his remains were never found. Although it seems odd that he seemed perfectly fine that morning when he ordered the oatmeal, which has led many to suggest he was targeted by someone at the casino or in the parking lot. Maybe when he appeared disoriented, someone realized he was a vulnerable target and took advantage of it. They robbed him, killed him, and then disposed of him somewhere in the desert. However, there should be video footage of the parking lot, considering this was a casino. Not to mention, why would the perp put his debit card back? Finally, some believe that he walked away to start a new life. In fact, police detectives would officially state that. They believed he left by choice, taking all the money from his ATM and walking away, leaving his old life behind. And those sightings in Texas was proof of that. And it could be that he had just felt embarrassed after losing his entire paycheck to the casino. Maybe this was an ongoing problem. Maybe it was going to cause issues with his wife. And if that is the case, then the man walking around clutching his stomach wasn't Trevor at all, and it was just a confused witness. It was 1980 when a 20-year-old Theresa Greaves and a friend would leave their home in New Jersey in hopes of settling down in Utah, more specifically, Salt Lake City. As a teen, she had met some missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and began attending church meetings. It was there she would befriend Bo Colosi, the friend that was moving with her across country. It was Theresa's wish to move closer to the church in Utah so she could immerse herself in Mormon culture, although that was a secondary reason. The main reason was Theresa was a huge music fan, but you could say she was a super fan of Donny Osmond, maybe obsessed, and it was here that she hoped she could get closer to him and perhaps even befriend him. In fact, she ran the Osmond fan club for a period of years. The two would drive across the country and found an apartment to rent, and Theresa soon began looking for jobs. It's unsure what she did for the first year, but we do know by the following year, she settled into a job as a housekeeper. Her friends would later report that she spent much of her time at a nearby TV studio that the Osmonds were operating, hoping she would see them and could snap off a few pictures. It was after this that Theresa lost her job and would spend the next couple of years applying for different positions and even moved out and in with another woman looking for a roommate. Many of the jobs that Theresa applied for were live-in babysitters, and she interviewed with quite a few people, mainly doctors. But it's on August 5th of 1983 that things got strange. She would call her grandmother back in New Jersey, the woman who had raised her, and told her she was going for an interview in Salt Lake City. As she lived in the area's suburbs, she would board a bus and head towards State Street. This was the last time anyone spoke to her. Theresa's new roommate was not worried at first when Theresa did not arrive back that night, assuming she had went to a friend's or perhaps even a boyfriend. But when she did not return within 2 days, the roommate would contact authorities to report her missing. The problem was, just 2 years prior, when Theresa had lived with the other roommate, she had left the apartment one day with 2 men from South America who didn't even speak English. She had apparently met them at a dance club that was visited often by students from BYU. The old roommate, in that instance, had also reported her missing when she didn't return that night. However, after she filed the police report, Theresa arrived home unhurt. This most likely played a role in the new missing report, since police no doubt thought, well, she will be back just like last time. But she didn't come back, and detectives did follow up on it, and found that Theresa had actually told her roommate that same day she left that she was meeting a couple in Salt Lake City who had a business opportunity for her. Detectives were able to track down one man that Theresa had spoken to that day, a doctor who had interviewed as a potential live-in babysitter. He stated she had called him around noon, and he informed her the job had been given to someone else. He also had no idea where she called from or where she went, and it's unsure if this was the job opportunity that she was allegedly going to speak about, or if she had another interview somewhere else. Investigators would also search Theresa's room, and found the only thing gone was her purse, a pair of heels, and her high school class ring. The case seemed to be going nowhere, so they tried tracking her down via a financial trail, like looking at her bank activity, which revealed she had deposited $98 that morning. After that, everything stopped. Police next went to the post office, where they opened her P.O. box and seen an absolute ton of mail. This had to throw police for a loop. When they began opening them, they seen that it was mostly letters for the Osmond fan club, and all of the letters seemed to reveal an outgoing correspondence with Theresa, although she always responded to the letters using an alias, Risa. Now detectives knew the search net was going to be even wider, and since this was 1983, looking for each one of these people was going to be time-consuming. But that's just what they did, contacting everyone from the Osmond fan club that had ever written Theresa. It took time, and after a lengthy investigation, they could safely rule out every one of these pen pals. After this, the case went cold. It was like she had just stepped off the bus inside the city limits and vanished. Actually, police weren't even sure she made it there, or even made it to the bus. That's how cold the case was, and it would remain that way for years. Her grandmother stayed in touch though, asking for updates over the next decade, but nobody had seen Theresa. Her grandmother eventually passed away in 1997, and police lost contact with the other relatives, but detectives themselves did pick up the cold case in 2012 and looked again. And just like before, they ran into a dead end. There was just nobody that had seen her since she left that morning, and Theresa had apparently not moved somewhere and started over, but they would eventually get an answer, because on February 5th, 2015, 32 years after Theresa walked out and went to a job interview, a man walking his dog would come across a skull setting up against a tree on a hillside next to the highway. He was later identified as Theresa. What had happened? Investigators still don't know, although they've had some ideas over the years. Interestingly, they called on fans of the Osmonds to look through any old fan club mailers and see if there was any correspondence with Theresa and what it revealed. However, that led to nothing. They then turned to a man already in prison for another murder, Douglas Lovell. He was on death row for the murder of Joyce Yost in 1985, which he had done to silence her after he sexually violated her. Her murder occurred just 2 years after Theresa's and just 30 minutes away. However, he would only state he didn't believe he knew anybody named Theresa, and detectives could never find that crucial link that he was responsible. Police then began to suspect an elaborate criminal syndicate could be the guilty party. Apparently, one was being ran out of the Utah State Prison and a halfway house in Salt Lake City. He was ran by a convict named Ronnie Lee Gardner, who worked with a man still unidentified to this day, known only as the Old Man, who would fence stolen property. The third man was a lifelong felon responsible for a ton of burglaries, Daniel Olson Ranquist. He had actually burglarized homes in the area just 2 days after Theresa was reported missing, and one witness even placed him coming out of the brush where Theresa's remains were eventually found, and that occurred right around the time she was reported missing. However, he had been deceased for years, and Ronnie Lee Gardner was executed in 2010, while the Old Man was never identified, although detectives still haven't been able to prove conclusively the two events were linked. But it is possible Theresa's class ring, which was missing from the remains, could have been stolen and sold to a pawn shop, and if it ever pops up, he would be a crucial link to finding out what exactly happened, since police would have a paper trail. And there's also the possibility that so-called job interview was nothing more than a scam, with a person potentially waiting to harm her when she arrived, possibly a sexual predator, or even someone that just wanted to rob her, or it might have been nothing other than an opportunistic stranger who had nothing to do with these theories. Instead, he just happened to see her getting off the bus. It was a warm summer's morning on August 15, 1950, when a man named Nick Mariana would walk out and inspect the baseball field before the day's upcoming game. Nick was the general manager of a minor league team known as the Great Falls Electrics, based in Montana. It was here around 11:30 that him and his secretary, Virginia Ronning, were walking around the empty stadium when something extraordinary would happen. Nick, standing and looking over the baseball diamond, would have a bright flash of light catch his eye from up above. Looking up, he would see two bright silvery objects rotating over the town of Great Falls at a speed he would later estimate to be around 300 miles per hour. These objects were about 50 feet wide and were 150 feet apart. Nick was stunned and knew immediately he needed to get proof of this. Thankfully, these objects became stationary over a smelter stack, so he would run out to his car and retrieve his 16mm movie camera and set it up and began recording the crafts, along with Virginia, who also watched. And since this was 1950, you can just imagine that the cameras, especially ones that were sold for amateur use, were not very good. In fact, he couldn't even record sound, but thankfully, the video was in color. In total, he only got about 16 seconds worth of footage, but it's footage that has went on to be iconic. The crafts then flew off into the distance, no longer observed by Nick or Virginia. This was just 3 years after the Roswell crash, and because of that, UFO interest was at a peak. But even though Roswell had the big documented photo of the so-called recovered crash, and although there had been several other reported UFO crashes, there had until that point never been any video footage. Nick would be the first in history to finally have it. Nick would then leave and go back and review his footage, and was happy to see what he had gotten. He then took it to a local newspaper who ran with the article. In the meantime, local citizens began asking to see it, so he began organizing times for groups from the community to come in and watch. The story by this point was picking up steam, with publications from every town in America beginning to print the story. One of these was a journalist who had actually went to see the film for himself, and after witnessing it, he would call Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and inform them of the sighting. And as you can guess, it didn't take them long to dispatch someone out to investigate. This would be U.S. Air Force Captain John Brynildson. He would go on to interview Nick Mariana as well as Virginia Ronning, who both told the investigator that, right after the UFOs passed, 2 fighter jets did as well. With this, the investigator thought he had a simple answer. What they had really seen were just reflections of these 2 jets that flew by, but he asked to see the film to take it back to Wright-Patterson where they could analyze it better. And this is where our first discrepancy comes up, because Captain John Brynildson would tell a reporter in Great Falls that he was taking back about 8 feet of film with him, yet documents would reveal later on that his official message to Wright-Patterson read that he was sending 15 feet of film back to study. This is important, and we'll come back to why in a second. Once the film arrived, it was examined very quickly and determined to be nothing more than the reflections of F-94 jet fighters that were seen in the area at the time. The film was then sent back with a letter which said, "There's nothing unusual about it." But here's where things got interesting. When Mariana got the film back, he noticed that the first 35 frames from the film were missing. These same 35 frames, or 3 seconds of footage, clearly showed the UFOs he had seen, which were spinning metallic discs with a notch on the outer frames. This was now gone. And if you think this is just Mariana's attempt to get famous, well, it wasn't just him, because remember all those people he showed it to in the community? They stood behind Nick and confirmed that the film they were now seeing had been tampered with and that a few seconds from the beginning had been removed. Of course, the Air Force strongly denied this and instead claimed they had removed 1 frame only, and that was because they had damaged it during analysis. Mariana did not take this well, as you might imagine, and neither did the rest of the country. Because of this, the Air Force would contact Mariana 2 years later and began convincing him to let them analyze the video again. He reluctantly agreed, only after the Air Force signed an agreement that they wouldn't remove any more frames from the film. Their conclusions at the time stated that the objects were not birds, balloons, or meteors, nor were they reflections from jets. They simply did not have an answer. This was followed up on a year later though, after the Air Force and CIA brought in the era's top scientist, who examined the best cases in Project Blue Book. After a careful study, it was ruled once again that these crafts were just reflections of the fighter jets in the area. What makes this intriguing is in the previous year, the Air Force investigation was led by a man named Captain Ruppelt, who would state that the F-94 jets weren't even in the area to cast a reflection. Not only that, but they were too steady to be reflections. This back and forth arguing over the video has went on for decades. It's been studied over and over, with some finding that it was just reflections, while others claiming it might have been birds, and others admitting they had no idea. The biggest study, though, would come from the Condon Report, which brought in a prominent physicist, Roy Craig, and psychologist, David Saunders. Craig would state when he interviewed Virginia Ronning and asked her more questions about that day, she hesitantly said, "What you have to remember in all this is that Nick Mariana is a promoter." And since then, many skeptics have implied that due to this statement and a few other things, that Mariana was just trying to draw attention to his baseball team. It doesn't help that he claimed for years to have been in possession of a letter that he had gotten from the Air Force, where they admitted they deleted some of the film, only for him to go on and claim that he had lost the letter. The comment from Virginia was enough to suit Craig, who chalked the whole thing up to nothing more than aircraft flying by. David Saunders, however, will go on to state he believed the video was more convincing of UFOs than anything that had been discovered up to that point, and many researchers have since agreed with him. The film is so important that it was stored in the National Archives, where it can still be found today. It's been featured in countless documentaries, TV shows, and videos online. It's never been debunked, although many would state you cannot prove a negative, and that's why today most people still believe it was just reflections of nearby aircraft, or maybe even actual aircraft that were flying overhead. but for ufologists, this is one of the biggest proofs of alien visitation. July 22nd, 1629, in a frontier outpost in what is now Albuquerque, New Mexico, a man known as Friar Alonso de Benavides was awaiting the arrival of the man that would take his place as custodian of the Franciscans. He had been superior of the Franciscan missions of New Mexico since 1622, and it was their sole goal to try and convert as many natives as they could to Catholicism. He had served the faith well and was now ending his term, to be replaced by someone else who would continue the cause. That man's name was Friar Pereira, and he showed up to the remote outpost where the two men met and began to converse. Friar Alonso would give Friar Pereira the basic gist of the day-to-day operations, and they would begin the transition of duties. And it's here Friar Pereira would give Alonso a letter that it came from the Archbishop-elect of Mexico, and it was a curious report. According to this letter, a woman named Mary of Jesus of Agreda had made contact with a tribe of indigenous peoples in New Mexico called the Humanos and Tilos. What is odd about this, you might ask? Well, Mary was still living in Spain. See, she was actually the superior at a community of nuns back in Agreda, and since 1620, she had claimed she had been visiting New Spain via an ability called biolocation, something we have discussed on this channel before. Biolocation is the alleged psychic ability, or in this case, miraculous ability, to be in two different places at the same time. According to her, and witnesses that vouch for her, she would go into a trance and would be teleported, or she sometimes said, transported by the aids of the angels to settlements of these two tribes, who were in New Mexico. It's here at these settlements the Blue Nun, or as she would come to be known, the Lady in Blue, would minister to them, all the while never leaving the monastery. Interestingly, she gave very descriptive reports of New Mexico. During her prayers, she would go into her trance and see bronze-skinned men and women in the wilderness of what is now New Mexico and Texas. She would note they used jawbones and teeth of animals to fashion their weapons. Their food was primitive, and for light, they used wooden torches. She knew she had been sent to bring them the Word of God, and she would visit over 500 times in that 9-year period, using this spiritual teleportation. She was even able to speak to them in their own language, and she even healed the sick. As she began to gain converts, she urged them to contact the local Franciscan friars, where our man, Friar Alonso, was at, and asked them to construct new missions for other tribes. Safe to say, she had created quite a stir back in Spain, and if not for her close relationship with the king, she probably would have faced the wrath of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, the Archbishop had sent Alonso this letter, and in it, he wrote that he had not heard of a tribe called the Tilos, which Mary claimed to have visited, but he had heard of Tejas, which were on the far reaches of New Spain in what is now Texas. He assumed Tejas was the Tilos that she had visited, but the Humanos, that was an exact match, because there was a tribe known to be traders, farmers, and bison hunters called the Humanos who roamed New Mexico and Texas. Friar Alonso was dumbfounded by all of this news. He couldn't believe the story of Mary's alleged travels. Actually, they had never even heard of Mary of Agreda, but Friar Alonso had his own story that was going to shock Friar Pereira, because just recently, a delegation of 50 Indians and their chief had just set up camp nearby the mission, and their name was the Humano. The delegation had came 500 miles from the east, probably somewhere in Texas, and they had told the Spaniards that they had been visited by a woman who dressed in blue. She taught them about her faith, speaking in their own language, and had converted many of them. They told her they wanted to be baptized so they could live as Christians, so she urged them to go find the local missionaries. Even more interesting was Friar Alonso stated that the Humanos had been coming in increasing numbers to request missionaries since 1620, the first year of Mary's teleportation to the southwest. At the time, there wasn't enough friars, but this year, the Humanos had become convinced, more than ever, that the Franciscans could now fulfill the request. Then, another friar who had worked under Alonso, a man named Juan de Salas, stated that since 1626, the Indians had been telling him about the lady in blue, and since he had spoke several Native American languages, he probably didn't misunderstand them. However, he had blown off the stories from the Humanos, thinking they had probably heard about Christianity from other Native American tribes. But when the Spanish showed the natives a small painting of another nun from a convent who wore the same clothes as Mary, the natives stated that it did look like the woman in the portrait, except Mary was young and beautiful, which Mary was, unlike the woman in the painting. They also stated she had came to them from the sky. The Spanish knew they had to investigate further, and they traveled the long distance back to the village, where they met with many thankful Umano villagers who had already built crosses and altars because the lady in blue had told them to. For several days, the friars baptized the Indians, and they taught them prayers and healed the sick. With this evidence, Alonso went back to Spain, where he would inform the king and the pope of the news, and would even meet with Mary herself. And Friar Alonso, after spending many months interviewing her, stated her detailed knowledge of New Mexico was legit. And that brings us to the mystery. What did the Umano tribe really see? Before we get to that, I do have to note that all of the people in this story were very real, even Mary, as she did cause quite a stir in her time. And it was also documented by the missionaries that had met the Umano that no group of Indians that the Spanish would ever meet knew as much about Christianity as the Umano. They were said to have been very knowledgeable about the scripture, so much so that it shocked the Spanish. But having said that, what about theories? Well, the first one is sort of a hybrid theory. The Umano were coming to the Spanish more and more and had been asking for baptism and to be taught Christianity. And meanwhile, Mary really was a mystic who claimed to have had these abilities, but the whole thing was just a coincidence, and neither were connected to the other. A lot of skeptics would even claim that the Umano's real drive in this was protection from the Apache, which once they converted to Christianity, the Spanish would be obligated to protect them. The part about the woman in blue may have came from the Umano traditions, but the friars, who were in need of more converts, just rode with the story of Mary, which influenced the king to keep funding their mission in the Southwest. Of course, this theory doesn't really explain how the Umano knew so much about Christianity, or how Mary had even heard of them. That's why so many believe this was a true miracle, that God had used Mary to reach the Umano and spread the word. But I'll let you tell me in the comment section below. February 1st, 2012, a woman named Gina Vendegna of Honolulu, Hawaii, was out working for a charitable cause. She had been going around the Liliha neighborhood looking for old cans and bottles that she could collect and give to the elderly in the area that were in need of some financial help. The cause was noble, and it often led to Gina not only looking for cans to pick up, but led to her oftentimes digging through trash bins. And it's in pursuit of these recyclables that she came across something she did not expect. She would see a clear Ziploc bag containing what she thought to be ginger root. It had just begun to dry out. Gina thought she was pretty lucky, because she had been wanting to plant ginger in her garden, so she stuck it in her purse and went on collecting more recyclables. Later that evening, as she returned home, she would reach for her purse and pull the ginger out to inspect it more, and what she found horrified her. What she thought was ginger was in fact shriveled human fingers, complete with fingernails. Gina couldn't believe it and was absolutely shocked. She began to shake nervously as she went through the neighborhood and began to talk to friends who all assured her that it was most likely monkey fingers, in hopes that Gina would relax. But Gina couldn't relax. She knew better, and she would head to the nearest police station. The veteran officers couldn't believe it either, and they too were a little bit disturbed. In total, there were 6 digits, some whole, some partial, and they still had soft tissue attached. They appeared to have been preserved in some way, since they did not smell bad and were in such good condition. Most likely, they had been kept in ice. Maybe most interestingly, though, was there were no pieces of a thumb. The story would get creepier, however. After forensic testing was carried out on the fingers, it revealed they belonged to a child between the ages of 2 to 5. Unfortunately, they couldn't determine the gender or ethnicity, although Some sources would go on to suggest it belonged to a girl between 2 and 4 years old, while others suggested it was a boy 3 to 5 years old. The Honolulu Police Department would begin to cross-reference the remains with their missing child cases throughout the state, but curiously, there were no matches. They then thought, well, maybe this was the fault of a sloppy hospital, so they began calling emergency rooms looking for children that had just been treated for traumatic finger injuries. But that too led to nothing. And if this whole ordeal wasn't creepy enough, it got worse, because obviously detectives went to inspect that garbage bin, and they would be particularly disturbed to see that it sat right next to a children's playground. This really upset the community, which is not a surprise. The police began to look for a suspect, but it was hard to do so when they couldn't even find the child that it had belonged to. They would of course interview Gina, the woman who found them, but she was cleared quick. Crazily enough, there's not much on this one. It's never really been followed up on, and the case never got closure. But we'll take a look at a few of the theories. One of the more interesting ones is that this child had to have the fingers amputated for some medical reason, and the family chose to keep them. I know that sounds strange, but it is a thing some people do. Like, there are instances of people keeping their amputated leg, but it's possible a family decided to hold on to the fingers of their child as a keepsake, and after a while began to feel a little bit unsettled about it and threw them away. The problem with this one is the 2 whole fingers and 4 partial don't really stick out as a medical amputation. Sticking with the medical theories though, it's also possible that it was just a mishandled medical disposure. Maybe it was part of a cadaver specimen, which would explain how they were so well preserved. However, things like this are usually regulated very closely. Finally, I put the darker theories last, which I don't really need to go into. The year was 1888, in the small town of Winslow, Arizona. It was there in an Old West general store that a man would walk in with a packet of goods in his arms. Moving towards the counter, he set down a large bundle that had been wrapped in a worn-out Navajo blanket, and he then proceeded to unwrap it. The clerk had done business with this frontiersman before, and he knew he was there to sell goods. He watched as the man would pull out an animal pelt that was a rich golden tan color with bold black stripes. The entire thing measured just over 7 feet from nose to tail and was beautiful. While the clerk fixated on this interesting find, the traveler would then pull out a jar which he explained was rattlesnake oil, which was accompanied by a couple of rattlesnake skins. The clerk pretty much ignored these, as the tiger-like hide was really catching his eye, and he would ask the man, what animal did this come from? The pioneer reached down to the counter and grabbed a block of tobacco which belonged to the clerk, and cut a piece off and stuck it in his mouth before replying that he had been out in the mountains for a few days doing a little prospecting, looking for a good location to set up a mine. On the 3rd night, he set up camp, had dinner, and laid down for the night, and that's when he would hear a sound which sent fear into him, the purring of a cat, a very large cat. Knowing this was cougar country, he knew he was potential prey. That's when he reached over and pulled his gun close to his side, rolled over onto his stomach, and looked out into the direction that he had heard the noise. He patiently waited, and just a few seconds later, about 20 yards away in the forest, he saw the outline of the creature, which was lit up by the campfire. Knowing it was now or never, he slowly lifted the gun, took aim, and fired. Knowing one shot wouldn't be enough, he quickly reloaded, which might have saved his life, because the wildcat he thought was a mountain lion would let out a blood-curdling scream and make a jump towards the prospector, but it overjumped him, something the man attributed to the light of the fire causing the creature to misjudge the jump. By this point, he must have assumed he had missed on his gunshot as well, and now here was the wildcat just a foot or two away. The terrified man spun around, aimed the gun at the big cat, pulled the trigger, and killed the animal, just before it pounced on him, no doubt saving his life. He got up and took a look at it, and soon realized it wasn't a cougar at all. In fact, he didn't know what it was. Although he had been all over these mountains for the past 13 years and learned quite a bit about the wildlife inhabiting it, he had never seen a creature like this before. Regardless, he would have to get his rest if he intended to travel the next day, and that he did, waking up early the next morning and then skinning the cat, knowing there were dealers in the area that often bought Native American crafts along with other curiosities. That is what led him to this shop in Winslow. That account has been taken from the February 23, 1888 edition of a newspaper from Fort Wayne, Indiana, entitled Gazette. The journalist who wrote it allegedly had gotten the story from another correspondent living in Winslow. He would wrap up the account by stating that the clerk bought the snakeskins and sold them to visitors from the east, and then took the jar full of rattlesnake oil and sold it to customers dealing with rheumatism. But of course, the interesting part in all this story is that hide. The clerk would buy this fur that seemed to be a Bengal tiger. He would hold on to it at first, trying to find someone that could identify it. He first took it to a nearby Navajo reservation, where he showed it to some of the oldest members, but none of them had ever seen an animal like this in the area. The clerk then found a book that gave descriptions of nearly every animal in the mountains of Arizona, and again, he found nothing similar. So what was this cat that nearly killed this frontiersman? Is it possible a tiger was actually living in the mountains of Arizona for a short time in the late 19th century? Well, let's start with the obvious theory, so I can go ahead and get it out of the way. That being yellow journalism. The report came at a time when the newspapers were printing just incredibly outlandish tales, especially those concerning the Wild West and cryptids. So it's just possible the writer at the paper in Indiana made the whole thing up, or the so-called correspondent he talked to in Arizona did. Either one is very possible, but considering this tale isn't real fanciful like some of the others at the time, like the ones about dragons, it's quite possible this cryptid story really occurred, but it still most likely has a very plausible explanation. One being, it was what the man originally thought it was, nothing more than a mountain lion, and for whatever reason, the pelt was described inaccurately or greatly exaggerated. Or another thought is this so-called frontiersman was actually a grifter. He instead stitched up a fake pelt and made up an elaborate story, all in the hopes of selling it for a huge price. Or maybe it was a cryptid. October 30th, 2004, Hood River, Oregon. 48-year-old Kimberly Forbes was talking with her daughter right before bedtime about her plans for the following day on Halloween. Kimberly would tell her she was actually having breakfast with a female friend who just lived about 3 miles down the road. After that, she intended to drive to Portland about an hour away to do some shopping, and then return home. It was just before the winter season, and Kimberly wanted to go ahead and stock up on some things for the upcoming weather, and this was the perfect weekend to do it. During this time, her daughter, who some sources cite as a teen, while others cite she was an adult, would not hear from Kimberly. And it's worth pointing out here that due to spotty records, I'm unsure if they lived together or not, but just reading between the lines seems to suggest they did not, which might be why, when her daughter didn't hear from her, she was not alarmed. But it would be the following Monday, when Kimberly did not show up for her job as a bank teller, that her daughter and everyone would know something was terribly wrong. After her daughter was notified that she did not arrive, she promptly reported her missing to the police, who then opened up an investigation to try and track down where she had been over the past weekend. And luckily for them, they knew exactly where to start. Kimberly's female friend that she went to have breakfast with on Saturday. Detectives would soon catch up to this friend and found out that Kimberly never showed up. And she didn't think much of it, figuring that Kimberly just got busy. Now investigators realized how dire the situation was. They had no leads, and it had been 2 days since her last confirmed sighting. To make matters worse, they couldn't find her vehicle either, which soon gave worry to the thought that maybe she ran off the road and into a waterway, and the SUV just hadn't been discovered yet. Well, that was actually not the case, because it would be close to 3 weeks later that her vehicle was actually discovered. But it was not in Portland, where she said she would be going. Instead, it was found in a neighboring city of Gresham, where she would have passed very close to on her way to Portland. More specifically, it was found in the parking lot of a Mexican restaurant, and what investigators found made it much stranger, because the rear passenger window had been broken out and a woman's clothing was found inside and outside the vehicle, along with some food containers and credit card receipts. The detectives didn't really know what to make of it, but obviously they had a bad feeling. This only increased when they opened up the car door and looked down the driver's side, which revealed the driver's seat had been pushed back quite a bit further than Kimberly would have needed. Now her family, along with the police, feared an abduction, although they did wonder how one could have happened, considering this had occurred between her home and the 3-mile drive to her friends. Police would comb the vehicle for clues, trying to uncover any little thing that could help, and they got lucky, because inside the car were fingerprints, which did not belong to Kimberly, nor anyone that would have ridden with her. An even better break would come along because these prints were on record, and police had their man. Easy enough, right? Well, this guy was a local to Gresham, and police were very interested and very confident that they were close to finding out what happened to Kimberly. So they brought him in for investigation, where he claimed he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Instead, he just broke into the car and stole some of the items from within. What these items were, police didn't disclose, but it didn't matter because the disappearance of Kimberly was more important. But even after they continued to grill him, he stuck to his story that he had nothing to do with her. In fact, he claimed that when he found the car, it had already been broken into. Police would eventually ask him to do a polygraph, and he passed. With that, and the fact that he was fully cooperative, he was ruled out as being involved with her disappearance. And you might be thinking that a passed polygraph means nothing, but it wasn't just that. Police actually had another lead that did confirm his story. Apparently, the car had been sitting at this same restaurant since at least November 5th, as confirmed by the first witness who seen it. So between that day, when it was first spotted, and when the police were notified 2 weeks later on the 19th, several people had walked by the vehicle, and detectives traced down as many of them as they could, and, drawing from their accounts, investigators knew that the car window had been busted out and robbed after it had been parked, which only contaminated the potential crime scene even more. So now police were back at square one. No real leads to speak of, and they didn't really know where to go next. Soon, they would even learn something about Kimberly that breathed new life into the investigation. Being 2004, a time way before apps were abundant on cell phones, people would sometimes look for love online. Kimberly was such a person. As detectives would learn, she had many online relationships in the past, and she had even met one of these previous online boyfriends. Could this hold the key? Detectives wondered, so they would get her computer and began searching the hard drive on it, in hopes of finding anyone online that she had talked to previously and planned to meet. This too, however, led to nothing. They could not find any evidence that she was going to meet someone from online, and in the 2 decades since, no other clues have popped up. Her credit cards have never been used, and her cell phone was turned off and never found. So there's many important unanswered questions. Has she even attempted to get to her friends that morning? There are hardly any places that she couldn't have been abducted on such a short route. Or was she taken from her own property? And more importantly, who and why? Well, it should be of no surprise that once again, the unsolved mystery community focuses on their favorite boogeyman, Israel Keyes. But this time, they might be right, as there are a few coincidences that could make him fit as a suspect. For one, he was living in Nia Bay, Washington at the time of Kimberly's disappearance, and that's about a 6.5-hour drive. And if you know the story of Israel Keyes, you know he would travel huge distances just to pull off the murders, so it wouldn't be surprising. But the big coincidence is, Kimberly's car was left about a mile or two away from Keyes' sister's home. However, most dispute this theory, and instead suggest the most simple theory that someone known to her was responsible. Maybe they even persuaded her to take them for a ride somewhere, and then the person dumped off the car far away. Although detectives couldn't find any enemies, or anyone that had some kind of obsession with her, it's still the one that makes the most sense. If it wasn't that, then most likely it was just a random carjacking or abduction. Carlos Medina was living the American dream. Arriving in Kodiak, Alaska in 1983 at the age of 26, the young Filipino started working at a local cannery, and within a decade, he was buying a local restaurant, one in which he began introducing Filipino food to the community. It was a smashing success. It would actually grow so much over the following years that he began to talk about expansion. He also left his job at the cannery and started at the Kodiak Electric Company. This allowed him to send money home to his father in the Philippines, as well as helping to immigrate his brother and sister. But it wasn't just that. He was very active in the community as well. He funded a local basketball team, helped elderly people behind on medical bills. He even served as president of a community service organization that did various charity work throughout the area. It may be for those reasons that he was elected to the school board and was about to run for city council. It's with his backstory that would make this next mystery seem impossible, and it's something that has puzzled detectives for decades, because on April 30th, 1993, the now 36-year-old Carlos Medina would begin this rainy Friday like he did just about every day. He would go to his job at the electric company, finish his shift, and go home, eat with his family, and sleep for a few hours, before waking up and going to the restaurant, meeting customers, and begin going over the financial books for the day. Occasionally, he would then go out with friends, before coming back to see the restaurant closed at 2 a.m., along with his younger brother, whom often ran the restaurant for him, a brother that Carlos helped immigrate to the U.S., a man named Rolando. This was the routine for a long time, and one that he stuck to almost religiously, so it was somewhat of a surprise that, on this night, he never arrived to the restaurant after his shift at the electric company ended. However, it wasn't one of those huge clues that something had went wrong, because Carlos was just so involved with other activities, as well as business meetings, that no one really got alarmed. In fact, he did have meetings that week with other bar owners who had been complaining about his restaurant's late-night karaoke, which was supposed to draw in patrons for food, yet was drawing them in for liquor instead, a violation of his beer and wine license. In any event, he would not arrive to the restaurant that night, nor did he make it home in the late-night hours, which alarmed his family when they woke up the next morning to see he had still not made it home. They in turn would call a member of the city council who, after calling around and finding that no one had seen Carlos, called the police himself. And since he was such a well-known person in the area, a search began almost immediately, one that was carried out all day, until late that night when his truck was found in a gravel pit on a deserted road behind town. This road led to the summit of a nearby mountain, and police blocked the access and left officers to guard the truck over the dark, rainy night until the search could continue the next day. In the meantime, all they could do was hope and wait. Hope that was soon dashed when detectives found blood on Carlos's truck. Not to mention, someone had smeared mud on the dashboard to obscure fingerprints. The next day, a helicopter came into the area while more searches canvassed the ground around the truck. It didn't take long to find his ring and his watch, which was sitting near the road. And a little later in the day, just a mile from his truck, Carlos's body was found. He had been beaten with a blunt object, to the point that his skull had caved in. Unfortunately, the heavy rains had erased much of the physical evidence, but police did discover that his wallet, briefcase, and ID were missing. As you can imagine, the community was shocked, but who would do such a thing, especially to a man that had done so much for the community? That would be just as difficult to figure out as the motive was, because although detectives kept chasing leads and kept claiming they had suspects, nothing ever came from it, and the case went cold surprisingly fast. In fact, Crime Stoppers would only get a grand total of 3 leads within the first year of the investigation. If you don't know how bad that is, consider this. The most complex murder case in Kodiak preceding Carlos's received nearly 130 tips in the first week. So as you can imagine, either no one knew anything or they were being kept quiet, which might be why Carlos's wife refused to do any interviews with media or even have her picture taken. And there might be a good reason for that caution. The lead investigator would interview a woman who was thought to know something about the case. After the interview, someone from a payphone called the police station and stated the woman's name and threatened to kill her. Police quickly moved this witness out of town. So obviously, there was a lot to this murder. But what could that be? Well, there were rumors, like maybe Carlos's restaurant success wasn't as grand as he let on. Or maybe he wasn't the guy he seemed. Others really wondered how he had just purchased a home that was near the equivalent of $450,000 in today's money. He was doing well, but not that well. At least, that's what the rumor mill suggested. Detectives did investigate the restaurant to see if maybe they had been working with a local drug racket, or if they were helping to launder money. But if they found any evidence of that, they kept it quiet. Others suggested a robbery gone wrong. But the problem with that was, he rarely carried cash. And isn't it a bit unusual for a robber to beat the victim to death? Investigators also found out that Carlos had been known to pick up hitchhikers. Could that be related? Detectives had no idea, but they did begin to speculate that whatever it was was probably connected to a private side of Carlos's life that his family didn't know about, but they couldn't have been prepared for the curve that came next. Remember I mentioned Rolando, who helped run the restaurant for Carlos, the one he helped put through school and helped to immigrate? Well, he would take over the restaurant, and eventually he ran it into the ground. It failed, and he went back to the Philippines. And soon rumors began to reach back across the ocean and into Canada, where Carlos's other brother, Jerry, lived, and these rumors suggested that Rolando was back home in the Philippines, living it up. He was rich. Jerry would even claim to have had a dream where Carlos showed up and told him he needed to go back home to find the answers. And Jerry did that, as he was obsessed in finding out who killed his brother. And just by chance, or maybe because Rolando heard that he was coming, Rolando got on a jet and went back to Alaska. Jerry wandered throughout his home when he got there, though, and found that he was living like a millionaire. He had installed a marble bathtub into the old family home and had a huge color television, 3 VCRs, 800 CDs, and tons of new clothes. But interestingly, he had Carlos's credit cards, which had been missing since the murder, along with his ID and checks. One he had written himself for $50,000. Not only that, he had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars in life insurance, giving only $100,000 to Carlos's widow and children. It should be noted here that Rolando at one time had been addicted to drugs, and it was only after promising Carlos that he was clean and left that life behind that he would help him get to the US and get his life turned around. And now he paid Carlos back with murder. Jerry would turn his little brother in, and after the detectives flew to interview him in the Philippines, where he acted unconcerned by the whole thing, he would be extradited back to Alaska, where he was charged with Carlos's murder in 1998. The state claimed he killed Carlos in a rage-fueled argument and then stole nearly the equivalent of $600,000 in today's money. So case closed, right? This one's not unsolved. Well, about that, before the trial even started, the charges were dropped. Turns out, way back in 1993, detectives would use this fairly new form of evidence collecting that was called DNA. And, well, they had found DNA of the killer way back then, and they collected it and kept it. Although the technology was very primitive at that time, by 2003, it had advanced quite a bit, and now detectives could prove conclusively that Rolando wasn't the killer, or he wasn't the one that actually did it at least, and most likely, he wasn't even there. The prosecutor stated that the new evidence was so compelling that it would create an ethical problem even pursuing a case against him. He did not state if this meant there was additional evidence to the DNA, but Rolando did plead no contest to 2 accounts of third-degree theft, which gave him 1 year probation. But if Rolando wasn't responsible, then who was? Well, unsurprisingly, he is not totally eliminated as a suspect. Instead, he's just been eliminated from being at the scene and being involved directly. Although he did end up in possession of Carlos's ID and credit card, it's unsure how or when he even got them. I'm guessing the police must have an idea which rules him out, at least directly. It could even be that another relative was responsible and gave Rolando the items, knowing that with his drug addiction past, he may not be able to resist using all the money, and that he would naturally be the top suspect. And it's also possible as well that he was targeted by someone outside the family who only stole the items to make it look like a robbery and then gave them to Rolando later on for the same exact reason. This seems very likely, considering the viciousness of the attack kinda rules out simple robbery. It's even possible he was targeted by some of these other businesses in the area that were complaining about his karaoke night, which was cutting into their alcohol revenue. Or maybe some kind of criminal organization was extorting him. In either case, with the advances in DNA technology, it seems likely this case will be solved sometime in the near future. May 11th, 1950, McMinnville, Oregon. A woman known as Evelyn Trent went outside around 7:30 p.m. to feed her pet rabbits, which lived on the farm that she owned with her husband, Paul. It was after finishing up that she began walking inside the home that something caught her eye. Up in the sky, silently gliding across, seemed to be a large metallic, disc-shaped object. This was just 3 years after Roswell, and it was at the height of the UFO craze, and she now thought she may have the best proof ever So she would quickly call for Paul, who was inside, and he would rush outside to see what all the commotion was about and looked in the sky to see it. And, thinking quickly, he rushed back inside and picked up his camera, which had already been loaded with film. He then went out and snapped off 2 photos before the craft quickly flew away, although not before being spotted briefly by Paul's father. But it's these 2 photos that would become iconic in the world of UFOs and the paranormal. They appeared to show what was a classic flying saucer. It was metallic and tilted slightly, which showed a domed top. And what made it especially remarkable is these are 2 of the most clearest UFO images ever taken, and their legitimacy has been debated since they first showed up in newspapers about a month later. Which brings us back to one of the earliest points of controversy. Why did it take a month? Well, that's what gives this case a little bit of sketchiness. For whatever reason, according to Paul, after he took the photos, he didn't really think much about it and was just kind of like, oh well, that was interesting, and he went back to his daily grind. He didn't even bother to get them developed until a few days later, after he used up the rest of the film roll on Mother's Day. But hey, maybe he didn't want to waste the money. But after taking them to get them developed and bringing them back home and seeing they had 2 really clear pictures of a craft flying around in the sky, something that would be considered earth-shattering news, the couple didn't say anything. It was only after a while later, when Paul would show one of his friends the photos, that the news spread. The friend was his banker, Frank Wortman, who was intrigued enough that he would display the pictures inside the bank's window. This soon brought the attention of a local reporter named Bill Powell, who convinced Paul to loan him the negatives. He would then take them to get them examined, and experts established the photos had not been tampered with, nor faked, and within days, it became front-page news in the local newspaper. Before long, they would show up in papers across the nation, and even Life magazine, the largest circulated magazine at the time. They were even flown around the country to appear on television shows, where they were interviewed about the events. Although it's important to point out, they never made one dime on any of this. Not to mention, they later regretted the publicity they had gotten, due to getting harassed and being made fun of. Even worse, they would lose the photos and negatives for decades, after Life magazine allegedly misplaced them. There were other issues that screamed hoax though, like Paul's original story was that both of them had been out in the backyard and spotted the object at the same time, before he had the idea to run in and get the camera. This account was told only once. However, the Trans had answers for all these inconsistencies. According to them, the reason that they sat on these photos as long as they did was not because they thought it was a UFO, but because they really suspected it was a secret military aircraft being tested out by the government, and they feared making a big deal out of it might get them into trouble. There's also the strange saga of the lost photos. The negatives were actually rediscovered in 1967, as they had been loaned to a Dr. William K. Hartman, an astronomer working with the Condon Committee, a government-funded UFO research project we have discussed here before. In his analysis on the case, he would later write, quote, "This is one of the few UFO reports which all factors investigated, geometric, psychological, and physical, appear to be consistent with an assertion that an extraordinary flying object, silvery, metallic, disc-shaped, tens of meters in diameter, and evidently artificial, flew within sight of 2 witnesses." End quote. He noted that the brightness of the underside of the object appeared to be lighter than the underside of the oil tank, which can also be seen in the image. This is due to atmospheric extinction, the same effect that makes distant mountains appear washed out and blue. He maintained that this proved the object was far away and not close up, although he would state he still couldn't rule out that the object was being hung by a string from the electric wire which ran above. In fact, that has been the skeptical argument ever since these photos debuted. By the 80s, investigators pointed to shadows found on the garage on the left side of the photo, which prove the pictures were taken in the morning and not evening, as the Trents claimed. So these new researchers stated that since they lied about the time of the day, it adds doubt to their whole story. Not to mention, they would eventually find out that the Trents had actually taken quite an interest in UFOs before having their own sighting. With this new research, Dr. Hartman of the Condon Committee would take back his assessment that it was a real UFO, and now sided with the hoax theory. But the researchers were not done. They also suggested that what people were really seeing was a detached side view mirror from a vehicle, most likely a Ford, which was then hung with a string from a power line. However, as many others have pointed out, there is no evidence of a string or thread in that photo. Or is there? By 2013, the case was once again opened by new researchers, who by this time argued that the geometry showed that it almost certainly was a small model with a hollow bottom hanging from a suspended wire, and they stated to have found presence of a thread above the object. However, as you might imagine, these findings are heavily disputed. The Trans died in the late 90s, always insisting that they had not hoaxed the photos, and to this day, no one has been able to conclusively prove that, nor has anyone been able to prove that it was a UFO, or even a US military aircraft. But you can let me know what you think in the comment section below. Real documented UFO, or some kind of hoax. Lake Tahoe, nestled on the Nevada-California border, is one of the biggest lakes in the United States. In fact, coming in 5th by volume after the Great Lakes, while its depth at 1,600 feet trails only that of Crater Lake in Oregon. It has long been a major tourist attraction in Nevada, mainly due to its ski resorts in the winter, and, vice versa, it's nearly perfect weather for summer recreation. But what if this deep lake is home to a legendary creature? Tonight, we're going to take a look at Tahoe Tessie, a large serpentine creature that is said to be as wide as a barrel. Its color ranges anywhere from a jet black to turquoise, depending on the witness. Although some say it might be a more gray color. It is also frequently described as having smooth skin and no scales. And strangely enough, this isn't a recent phenomenon. We don't know for sure due to lack of records, but one of the earliest accounts did go back as early as 1865, when a man we only know as L.C. Coggin claimed to have seen a serpent with a 14-foot wide head, black scales, and colossal body that was over 600 feet in length. And just like the papers would do at the time, they speculated that it was really a plesiosaur that somehow did not go extinct. And it's important to note here, the name Tahoe Tessie wasn't used yet. That wouldn't come until over a century later, when a local resident coined the name in 1975 after going on a kayaking trip and would hear stories about the creature, although he never seen it himself. But by the time that he had came up with it, the serpent-type creature sightings had been occurring regularly since the 1950s, often by hikers, but even more reputable witnesses like police officers, who recorded seeing a large black hump pacing their boat at 60 miles per hour. Most of the sightings, though, came in the late 70s and into the 80s. One of the earliest involved 4 witnesses who claimed to have seen a serpent-like creature hunting a school of trout. They claimed it was 30 to 60 feet long and thick as a telephone pole, and its movement went up and down, not side to side. This one was deemed noteworthy because of the fact that 4 people described seeing the same creature. Maybe the most interesting sighting, or suspicious, came from a local TV station owner, a man named Mike Conway, who actually claimed to have caught the creature on video during a commercial shoot. According to him, it all started when several children pointed to the water and shouted, "It's Tessie," as a noticeable wake in the water appeared. Unfortunately, or maybe conveniently, this video footage was later destroyed and is lost forever. But although the sightings kinda died down over the 90s, they did return by the 2000s, with one particular sighting that stands out. Mickey Daniels in 2005, who was a longtime fisherman and former police officer. He claimed to have seen a large V-shaped wave cutting through the calm water when there were no other boats around, and judging by its movements, he did not believe it was caused by a fish. What makes this sighting interesting is 2 more visitors at the lake, close to the same time, reported seeing a dark shape with multiple humps about 100 yards from the shore. Unfortunately, this was just a little before everyone was carrying a cell phone around with them, so none of it was recorded. Although there have been a few photos over the years that are not the most convincing, but still leave room for speculation. It's also been alleged over the last few years that some kind of video footage exists, and, for whatever reason, is being covered up. The sightings, too, are not completely relegated to being above water. Some of them have came from beneath, which fits the theory, or maybe a long-held rumor, that Tessie lives in underwater caves. In fact, 2 divers in the 80s reported finding an underwater cave and seeing a creature shoot out of it, leaving silt stirring about. They noted that it had left 2 large fin prints behind. Interestingly, this came just a few weeks after 2 fishermen reported seeing a serpent-like creature in the same exact area. So what are people most likely seeing? It should be of no surprise that the overwhelming majority of people err on the side of the skeptics and state that it's probably nothing more than the misidentification of ordinary objects like submerged logs or complex wave patterns that in low light can look like a lake monster, or it could even be a lake sturgeon or some other oversized fish, like a lake trout. Both can be bulky and do surface occasionally. He may even be a group of smaller fish moving together. Of course, maybe it really is a plesiosaur that somehow did not go extinct.